I'm a trauma surgeon in my late 30s. If you've ever been in an ER on a Saturday night, there's a chance you might have seen someone like me, hair tied back, dead-eyed from the night shift, scrubs with a stain or two I haven't had time to notice. The job doesn't allow for much sleep or personal time, and it's taken its toll over the years. I've lost 2 relationships to the hours, and most of my friends gave up inviting me to gatherings a long time ago. It's not a glamorous life, but the thrill of saving lives, of being the one person standing between someone and the end of their life, is addictive. I thought I was used to seeing the worst of humanity, the accidents, the violence, the things people do to themselves and each other. But some cases just get under your skin, and no amount of experience can make you immune to them. This one started like any other night on call. Coffee, paperwork, half listening to the paramedics while they updated us on the incoming trauma cases. Just after midnight, I heard a voice crackle through the radio about a gunshot victim en route, a young man in his 20s. Gunshots aren't uncommon where I work, so I didn't think much of it until they brought him in. He was sprawled on the gurney, unconscious, his body mangled by not just 1, but 3 gunshots, all clustered close to his chest. There was too much blood, even for a gunshot victim. I barked out orders, tried to staunch the bleeding, my team frantically working to get a 4-line in, all of us moving like we were on autopilot. I've worked on enough gunshot wounds to have a rhythm, but this was different. Every time we managed to close off one bleed, another one would open, like his body was tearing itself apart from the inside. As I worked, I noticed something odd. His body was covered in old scars, lines crisscrossing over his chest, arms, even his legs, like he'd been cut or burned repeatedly. His face was swollen, bruised in odd places, the kind of marks you'd expect from a fight, but more brutal. My mind was racing, trying to understand the situation, when a nurse came over to whisper in my ear. She'd found a tattoo on his upper arm, something that looked like gang insignia, but it was off in a way I couldn't put my finger on. There was a strange symbol next to the tattoo, a marking I didn't recognize, but it didn't matter in that moment. We were losing him, and I had no time for theories. Hours went by in a blur. We were in surgery after surgery, trying to stop the internal bleeding to mend the shredded veins. I can still hear the sound of his pulse dropping on the monitor, those nauseating beeps dragging out, mocking me with every falter. His heart would stop, then we'd revive him, only for it to stop again. It was like he was stuck in this endless limbo, teetering between life and death. By the time we finally got him stable, it was morning, and I was physically and mentally drained. I rarely felt any emotion after a surgery. Joy, relief, even sorrow. But I felt it then. I felt this dread, something irrational telling me this was just the beginning of something I couldn't control. A couple of days later, I was called back to examine him. He was awake, disoriented, but his vital signs were stable enough. I stood there, clipboard in hand, trying to make small talk, asking him how he was feeling, if he remembered anything from the incident. He just looked at me, his eyes a hollow gray, devoid of anything I could read. He didn't answer at first, just stared at the ceiling, almost like he was trying to escape into the blankness above him. I was about to leave when he finally muttered something. I leaned in, thinking he was asking for water or pain meds. But his words were something else entirely. "They'll come back for me," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "They always do." I tried to get him to explain, but he just shut down, wouldn't say anything more, eyes going vacant. I brushed it off as paranoia. Trauma victims often come out of surgery feeling frightened, confused, sometimes seeing enemies where there are none. But his words stuck with me, replayed in my mind every time I thought about him over the next few days. Then, just as he was about to be discharged, he disappeared. Security couldn't explain how he'd left. One minute he was there, in his bed, hooked up to all the monitors, and the next he was gone, like he'd never been there at all. We filed the report, did all the paperwork, but there was no trace of him, not even on the cameras. It felt impossible. About a month later, I was working a night shift when the same patient was wheeled in again. This time, he looked even worse. His wounds were deep gashes along his torso, jagged and raw, as if something had clawed through him. He was barely conscious, muttering nonsense under his breath, his body twitching with every shallow breath. I remember glancing at the nurse, feeling a chill run down my spine. both of us silently acknowledging that whatever this man had been through wasn't normal. As I worked to stop the bleeding, he started murmuring again, repeating the same phrase over and over. "They're coming, they're coming." His eyes were wild, rolling back as he spoke, like he was lost somewhere none of us could reach. I wanted to tell him he was safe, that we'd protect him, but something held me back. His wounds, they weren't ordinary. They were too precise, almost like someone had purposefully avoided hitting anything vital, like they wanted him alive, but just barely. Despite our best efforts, he didn't make it this time. He flatlined in the early hours of the morning, his body finally giving out. When I pronounced him dead, there was this silence, thicker and heavier than anything I've ever felt. The kind of silence that leaves you feeling watched, vulnerable. I signed off on the paperwork, handed the body over to the morgue, and went home, feeling like I was leaving behind more than just a patient. But that wasn't the end. A few weeks later, I got called into the morgue. The staff were on edge, and the head coroner looked like he hadn't slept in days. I asked him what was going on, but he just led me to one of the autopsy rooms. And there he was, my patient, his body laid out on the table, but somehow fresh. His skin was still soft, his eyes partially open, like he'd just died a few hours ago. I looked at the coroner, expecting an explanation, but he just shook his head, said the body hadn't started decomposing, that he'd never seen anything like it. For days, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still alive, that any moment he'd sit up and finish whatever he had started. Every noise in my apartment felt like footsteps. Every shadow seemed to shift. I can't explain it, can't even make sense of what I saw, but I know this. That patient wasn't just a victim of violence. Whatever had been chasing him, whatever he'd been running from, it was something none of us could fight or protect him from. And somehow, I feel like it hasn't stopped, like it's still out there, waiting for the next poor soul to fall into its grasp. I've lived with obsessive-compulsive disorder for as long as I can remember. Not the kind that makes you tidy up or double-check if the door is locked a few times, but the kind that shoves thoughts in your brain like broken glass that you can't shake out. I don't do rituals out of habit or preference. I do them because if I don't, my brain screams at me until I do. It tells me that if I don't count things in fours, my mom will die in a car crash, or if I step on a crack, my dog will get cancer. It's like this constant buzzing, a drone of panic that pushes me to fix things that aren't even broken, because if I don't, something really bad will happen. I live in a bubble of what-ifs and just in case, and it's exhausting. I've tried the medications, SSRIs, benzodiazepines, even antipsychotics for a while, but they left me either numb or jittery, a different kind of uncomfortable, one that still didn't quiet the fears. Therapy, CBT, ERP, they help a little, but they feel like putting duct tape over a crack in the wall. You know the crack is still there. You feel it every second, threatening to shatter. So you go on with life, pretending you're okay while your brain loops the same horror reel over and over. A couple of months ago, I had to move to a new apartment. It was just a few streets over from my last place, so nothing major, same creaky floors, same moldy smell seeping in from the alley outside. But it was different enough that every fiber of my OCD flared up, prickling like needles under my skin. New places are minefields. I don't know the lay of the land yet. I don't know which parts are safe to touch, where I can stand, or how to move through a space without setting something terrible in motion. On the third day, I noticed a loose floorboard under my bed. It was one of those ancient apartments where nothing is level, nothing is in place. I convinced myself that if I didn't fix it, something, though I didn't know exactly what, would happen. Maybe I'd trip on it in the dark, or worse, my intrusive thoughts might bleed into reality. So I pried it up just to check, just to fix whatever might be off. Underneath, there was a small, dark space with something crammed down inside. At first, I thought it was just junk, old newspapers or insulation. But when I pulled it out, I realized it was a stack of Polaroid pictures, maybe 40 or 50 of them. The film was worn, slightly faded, but the images were clear enough. Each photo was a shot of a single room, like someone had documented every inch of this apartment. One of the living room, one of the bathroom, one of the kitchen, and then one of the bedroom, the very room I was standing in. The thing was, these photos weren't just of the rooms. They were of the rooms filled with things that didn't belong to me. A frayed armchair in the corner, a ceramic cat on a shelf, dirty dishes in the sink. It was like looking into a parallel life, like peering into the life of the person who had lived here before me. And then I noticed something else. In the corner of some of these photos, there was a shadow, just barely visible, but there, the shadow of a person standing just out of view, like the photographer had been trying to capture someone without them knowing. I was already rattled, my nerves frayed from the move, but this pushed me into a whole new layer of dread. I wanted to put the photos back, pretend I'd never seen them, but my brain wouldn't let me. It was telling me that if I didn't look through each and every one of them, something would go wrong. Something horrible, something I wouldn't be able to undo. So, one by one, I went through the photos, dissecting each one, counting the items, noting every detail. I was halfway through the pile when I got to a photo of the bathroom. It looked like any other bathroom shot. White tile, chipped sink, a bar of soap resting on the edge of the tub. But in the mirror, there was a figure. At first, I thought it was just my reflection. The way the flash bounced off the mirror, it created a vague shape that could look like a person. But then I realized that the figure was turned sideways, not facing the mirror. And it wasn't me. It was someone tall wearing something dark and loose, standing just beyond the edge of the mirror frame, as if they were looking into the bathroom from the doorway. I felt my skin go cold, my stomach knot up. I tried to breathe through it, to rationalize it. Maybe it was a trick of the light, or maybe the previous tenant was just documenting the place before they moved out. But then I found the last photo. It was different. Not a room, not an object, not a shadow. It was a close-up shot, taken so close that it blurred the details, leaving only a smeared hint of a face, just eyes and a mouth, frozen in some expression I couldn't understand. I stared at it for what felt like hours, trying to decipher if it was a smile or a scream. I couldn't sleep that night. I sat up in bed, every creak of the apartment amplified, every whisper of sound sending chills down my spine. My brain was doing backflips, trying to piece together a logical explanation, but nothing felt right. The only thing that felt true was this visceral, gut-deep certainty that I was being watched. The next few days, I tried to ignore it. I kept telling myself it was just my OCD spiraling, that I was projecting my anxiety onto the apartment, onto the photos. But then things started happening. At first, it was small. Items moved an inch or two, lights flickering even though I just changed the bulbs. And then one night, I heard footsteps in the hall, slow and deliberate, like someone was walking with purpose. I bolted out of bed, heart hammering, and yanked open the door. There was nothing there, just the dim light from the street seeping in through the windows. But the worst part was when I started hearing whispers. Late at night, as I lay there, trying to force myself to sleep, I'd hear voices, muffled, like they were coming from the other side of the wall. At first, I thought it was my neighbors, but the voice was too close, too personal, as if it were just on the other side of my headboard. It was saying things I couldn't make out, fragments of words, just barely intelligible, but the tone was familiar. The voice sounded like mine. The landlord didn't believe me when I asked him about the photos. Said they were probably left behind by a previous tenant, no big deal. But I couldn't shake it. The fear had burrowed into me, become something more than just my usual obsessions. It felt real, and the feeling that someone was watching me, that someone was there in the room, grew stronger each night. I started feeling a pressure in the room, like the air was thicker, denser. And every night, right before I drifted off, I'd feel something cold brush against my shoulder. I thought about leaving, about breaking the lease, and finding somewhere else to live. But it wouldn't change anything. I knew this thing, whatever it was, would follow me. So now I just sit here, in the dark, waiting for the whispers, for the shadow that hovers just beyond the edge of my sight. Because deep down, I know that whatever is watching me has been there all along, hiding in the gaps of my mind, feeding off my fears, growing stronger every time I close my eyes. And I don't think it will ever let me go. It was one of those late nights in the office, where my main task was apparently refreshing my inbox every 5 minutes, waiting on some elusive hiring manager to make up their mind. I'd been through 3 interviews, 1 technical test, and endless emails with HR that all but promised I'd be the new team player they'd been looking for. Now, weeks in, not a word. My friend said it was a good sign when it took a while. They're considering you seriously, they said. But But as the weeks slipped by, it felt like I'd poured my effort into the void, rehearsing stories about my biggest challenges and how I handle conflict. Did any of it even matter? The final insult was that the only follow-up I'd gotten was an email inviting me to apply for another role they just posted. A similar frustration was brewing in the world of concert tickets, and it was something we'd all raged about before. My friend Kara was an avid festival goer, and every year, she spent months planning her lineup, down to color-coded charts. Last year, she'd waited for hours on Ticketmaster, only to find out the tickets were completely sold out within seconds. Later, she found out why. Large companies were buying out blocks of tickets, only to resell them at obscene markups. It wasn't illegal for music festivals like it was for sports events, and it left people like Kara crushed and priced out. It's like they're dangling a carrot just out of reach for regular people. She'd ranted to me once, showing me how resale prices were quadruple the original. The kicker was this wasn't just festivals. It seeped into the political realm, too. Politicians trading stocks, using insider knowledge to build their fortunes while the average person was left to watch helplessly as their portfolio tanked. How was this different from companies hoarding tickets? The game was rigged in favor of those already in power, those already wealthy, and there was a smug irony to it. They called it the American dream, but in reality, it felt more like a rigged lottery where only the insiders had the winning numbers. And then, there was the case of the so-called war on drugs in our own city. Every time I went out to a bar or walked through the train station, the drug-sniffing dogs would be there, with groups of police like they were preparing for a raid. I'd heard stories about people being strip-searched at random, forced into humiliating positions, only for the officers to find nothing. Sydney's nightlife was basically under siege, and I knew a girl from my building who'd gone through it firsthand. She'd been pulled aside, forced to empty her bag in the middle of the train platform, with strangers watching like it was some twisted reality show. The dog handler had insisted his canine signaled on her, though she was as clean as a whistle. No apology, no explanation, just the piercing embarrassment and the reminder that we were all potential criminals in the eyes of the law. Data privacy had also taken a sinister turn. It was an unspoken truth that companies sold our data as casually as a sidewalk hot dog vendor. Every time we clicked I accept on some lengthy, jargon-laden terms of service, it was like signing away our privacy, giving them permission to track us, profile us, and sell that profile to the highest bidder. It was disturbing how normalized it all was. No one even blinked anymore. I remember downloading a simple budgeting app once, only to find it required permissions to access my contacts, my GPS, even my photos. It's just the price of admission, my friend shrugged. But why should it be? Why should my weekend brunch photos or my aunt's email address be up for sale? And then, there were the flashing blue LED headlights that seemed specifically designed to ruin everyone's night vision. Driving home one evening, I felt like a deer caught in the headlights, literally. Some guy in a massive SUV came barreling toward me with what felt like stadium lights glued to his car. My eyes watered, and I squinted, almost driving into the curb. Why did we need lights that could probably be seen from space? There were jokes about it online, but honestly it felt dangerous, especially when it seemed like every second car now had them. These weren't headlights. They were weapons of mass disorientation. Every conversation with friends seemed to circle back to the absurdity of it all. Big corporations were bending the rules, and the people who could do something about it, the politicians, were too busy making shady stock trades. Meanwhile, citizens were left to navigate a landscape full of bright headlights, privacy invasions, and the lurking threat of getting frisked at any random checkpoint. There was this simmering frustration among everyone I knew, a sense of powerlessness and a growing anger. One night, a friend named Leo joked about running for office with a platform that promised no more ghosting candidates, real concert tickets for real people, and a sweeping ban on overly bright headlights. No more hidden clauses, no more sleazy deals, he declared, as if announcing his candidacy in a comedy sketch. We all laughed, but I realized we all wanted that too. We just wanted a world where people played fair, where jobs were real, and where the rules didn't feel like they were written exclusively for the rich or powerful. We often imagine that danger lurks in obvious places, dark alleys, high cliffs, or the deep sea. Yet the reality is much more unsettling. In the most mundane moments, life has a way of revealing just how fragile we are. We face risks that we rarely acknowledge, hidden behind everyday choices or seemingly benign actions. One summer evening, I found myself learning this hard lesson on an ordinary drive home. The day had been hot, the air thick with humidity. I was on my way back from a friend's place, feeling drowsy from a lazy afternoon by the pool. The freeway was quiet, and as I rolled the windows down to feel the cool breeze against my face, I absent-mindedly fiddled with the radio. It was a routine I'd done hundreds of times before. 1 second, 2 seconds, my eyes flicked down to adjust the station. In the next instant, a flash of blue caught my eye, too close, too sudden. A small sedan veered wildly into my lane, barely inches from my front bumper. In that fraction of a second, I felt every nerve in my body fire in pure panic. My foot slammed the brake instinctively, the tires shrieking against the asphalt as I swerved. I barely avoided hitting the guardrail, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly they ached. As the adrenaline subsided, I realized how close I had come to death. One moment of inattention, a brief distraction, was all it had taken to nearly end my life. That night, lying in bed, I couldn't shake the thought of how quickly everything could have changed. I started reflecting on the countless things in life that we rarely consider, things that could so easily turn fatal if we let our guard down. It reminded me of a story my grandfather once told me. He had been an old-school, grizzled factory worker, tough as nails, and he always warned me about what he called the silent dangers, everyday things that could go wrong without warning. One of those dangers he mentioned was tension cables. In his factory days, he'd worked around heavy machinery and cables under extreme tension, which, when released unexpectedly, could snap with a force strong enough to slice through steel. He told me about a man who had lost his life when a cable had suddenly snapped, and I could still remember his voice, his gruff warning. 1 minute you're there, the next gone. Just like that. It was hard to imagine such a violent end from something as inconspicuous as a cable. But he'd seen it, lived through the aftermath. It was one of those lessons he wanted me to take seriously, though at the time I had shrugged it off. With these thoughts whirling in my mind, I found myself growing more cautious. I became more vigilant about the things that could easily be overlooked, like the household cleaners under the sink. My roommate once left a note saying she had mixed bleach and vinegar to scrub the bathroom. Horrified, I sat her down, explaining how those two cleaners combined create a toxic gas capable of filling a small room with lethal fumes. She stared at me, shocked, and I realized how close she had come to making a simple mistake that could have killed us both. There are so many household items, seemingly harmless, that can turn deadly if used incorrectly. I began reading up on other hidden dangers, hoping to protect myself and those around me. I learned about riptides, those treacherous currents that silently drag even strong swimmers out to sea in mere moments. Last summer, during a family beach trip, I saw it happen. My cousin, a confident swimmer, had been out in the water, and suddenly, she was no longer swimming parallel to the shore, but further and further away. I shouted for her to swim sideways, to escape the current, but panic had already set in. By the time a lifeguard reached her, she was exhausted, clutching onto the board they'd brought out. Afterward, she told me, voice shaking, I thought I could beat it, but the water was so strong. It was chilling to realize how easily a familiar place could turn deadly, how quickly the ocean had almost claimed her life. Then there was my co-worker who a few years back had nearly died from what he thought was a harmless fall. He had tripped over a loose piece of carpet, tumbling backward and hitting his head against the wall. At first, he brushed it off, thinking it was just a bump. But later that evening, he started feeling dizzy and nauseated. His wife, thankfully, insisted on taking him to the hospital, where they found he had a brain bleed. He had been hours away from slipping into a coma. It was a stark reminder that even something as simple as a stumble could prove fatal if ignored. Another story that stayed with me was about a girl from my neighborhood, someone I'd grown up with. She had been texting while crossing the street, assuming the approaching car would stop. It didn't. The driver hadn't seen her until it was too late, and in the blink of an eye, she was gone. The memory of her haunted me, her life cut short by a moment of distraction. We all do it. Flick through our phones while walking, trusting that we'll hear or see danger coming. But the world doesn't always work that way. And sometimes, by the time we realize our mistake, it's already too late. It's terrifying how we take so much for granted. How we assume the roads will be clear, the air will be safe, that our lives will roll along without interruption. But life is rarely that forgiving. There are dangers we don't see, ones we don't even think to look for. Yet, despite all this, I realize that living in constant fear isn't the answer. Instead, it's about respecting those silent threats, staying aware, and making choices that prioritize safety over complacency. After my close call on the freeway, I started looking both ways before stepping into intersections, even on a green light. I double-checked things at home, the lock on the ladder, the position of the sharp knives, and the tension in my bike's brake lines. These small acts of caution felt less like paranoia and more like survival skills, like ways of honoring my own life. The world is full of hidden dangers, and life can change in an instant. I'm reminded of this every time I step onto the freeway, glance down from a high place, or simply breathe in that comforting scent of fresh air. It's a humbling reminder that, while we may not always see what can end us, we can always choose to live carefully, to recognize those silent risks, and respect the thin line that keeps us alive. In the end, life is a fragile, precious thing, and maybe it's the small choices, the moments of awareness that truly make a difference. I'm going to start this by saying that I am, or at least used to be, a pretty reasonable person. I never liked those people who were constantly worrying, double-checking locks, convinced someone was watching them through their phone, or whatever. But something happened to me that I can barely even think about without breaking into a cold sweat. I still don't know how I ended up in that situation, but I'm pretty sure there's no way out now. It started when I got a new job after my last company folded. I had been on a temporary contract with them, so when they went under, there was no severance package for me. For 3 months, I was living on my savings, applying anywhere that would take my resume seriously. Finally, I got an offer to work in IT support at a small firm located in an industrial area on the edge of the city. The job seemed low stress, maybe even boring, but they were paying better than my last job, and I needed the stability. The day I was offered the position, I accepted immediately. The office was frankly a little strange. For one, it was almost entirely empty. There were 2 other people in my department and a couple of folks on the sales team, but that was it. Most days, I'd walk past rows of empty cubicles. Apparently, the company did something with data encryption, nothing I needed to know much about. I just had to keep the systems running and troubleshoot when there was a problem. One of my tasks involved managing the server room, a small, windowless place filled with racks of humming machines, stacked all the way up to the ceiling. It was freezing cold in there like most server rooms, and I hated going in. On my 3rd week, my supervisor, Frank, called me in for what I thought was a regular one-on-one meeting. He asked me how I was settling in and then got right down to business. He wanted to talk about protocols, specifically about after-hours access. I was supposed to get a text whenever there was any after-hours activity in the building that wasn't scheduled maintenance. And if I saw that, I was to call him immediately, no matter the time. The first time I got one of those texts, it was 3 a.m. on a Tuesday. I was groggy, but I remembered what Frank had said, so I called him. He picked up instantly, like he'd been waiting for my call. He asked me for the exact time of the alert, told me not to worry, and hung up. The next day, I asked him what that was about. He just shrugged it off, saying it was probably a glitch, but he thanked me for following protocol. That's when I started noticing odd things around the office. There were small details that didn't add up. Twice, I found that my desk had been shifted slightly when I arrived in the morning. Another time, a drawer that I always kept locked was wide open. And it wasn't just me. One of my coworkers in IT, Julia, mentioned the same thing had happened to her, but she just laughed it off. She said that maybe we had some overzealous night janitors, but there were no janitors listed on the staff directory. When I asked Frank, he just brushed it off and said that cleaning was done after hours by contracted help. Things took a turn one Friday night. I was the last one there, finishing up some late paperwork. I had just turned off my computer when I noticed movement in the reflection of my screen. I thought it was Julia coming back to grab something, but when I looked up, the office was completely empty. I laughed at myself, chalked it up to my eyes playing tricks on me, and headed to the elevator. As I was waiting for it to arrive, I saw a man coming down the hall, a man I'd never seen before in the building. He wore a suit, looked official, but didn't make eye contact. He just walked past, went into the server room, and shut the door behind him. It seemed weird, but I was tired and didn't want to get into it. As the elevator doors opened, I got a text. Unscheduled activity detected in server room. I'd never gotten a text while inside the building before, and my stomach dropped. I turned back toward the server room, half expecting to see that guy coming back out, but the door was still shut. I thought about calling Frank, but it was after hours, and I didn't want to seem paranoid. I left, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was seriously off. Monday came, and I went back to work like normal, but I could tell something had changed. Frank barely looked at me and avoided any talk about the alerts. That night, I was restless thinking about that man, about the server room, and the fact that Frank had never properly explained anything to me. Around 2 a.m., I decided to drive back to the office. I knew I wasn't supposed to be there after hours, but I needed answers. The building was dark when I arrived. I used my access card and slipped inside, moving quickly down the hall to the server room. I half expected someone to be there, but it was empty. The rows of servers were humming louder than usual, and there was a faint, stale smell in the air that I hadn't noticed before. My phone buzzed with a text. Unauthorized entry detected. Server room. I ignored it and moved toward the last rack of servers, where the noise seemed to be loudest. That's when I noticed a small, half-hidden door at the back of the room. I could have sworn it hadn't been there before. It was a heavy door, and it took a lot of force to open. Inside was a cramped staircase leading down. The smell was stronger here, metallic and sour. I descended, and the further down I went, the worse it got. I was practically gagging by the time I reached the bottom. There was a single corridor with more doors on each side, all marked with numbers instead of names. I stepped closer to the first door and leaned in to listen. That's when I heard it, a faint scratching sound like someone or something was clawing at the other side. My heart was racing, but I couldn't move. I strained to listen, and then, unmistakably, I heard a voice. It was quiet, hoarse, barely more than a whisper. "Help me, please," I stumbled back, ball rising in my throat, and I turned to bolt back up the stairs. But just as I reached the bottom of the steps, I heard heavy footsteps coming down from above. I had nowhere to go. In a panic, I ducked into one of the side rooms. There were no lights, so I crouched in the darkness, listening as the footsteps reached the bottom. Someone walked past the door where I was hiding, and I caught a glimpse through the crack. A man in a suit, the same one I'd seen that Friday night. He stopped outside the door for a moment, and I held my breath, praying he wouldn't come in. After a few agonizing minutes, he moved on. When I was sure he was gone, I slipped out of the room and bolted up the stairs, not looking back until I'd cleared the building. I didn't go back to work the next day. Frank called, left me a voicemail, and I deleted it without listening. A few days later, I got an email saying my contract was terminated, effective immediately. That was the last I heard from them. Since then, I've tried to move on, but every now and then, I get a text in the middle of the night, always the same message. Unscheduled activity detected in server room. I'd always lived for adventure and thrill, the feeling of weightlessness as my snowboard cut through powder on mountain peaks, the kind of rush you get only a few seconds before catching air. I thought nothing could scare me, that I'd already pushed every limit I could. But none of that came close to what happened one evening. That one time I truly felt my heart break its rhythm. No longer a beat, but a maddening drum, pounding through every nerve, warning me I'd gone too far. It was a winter trip to the Rockies, an annual tradition among a close-knit group of us. Usually, I'd be the one urging everyone to go just one step further, to find the hidden trails and untouched snow, the secret corners where the only audience was the wind and our own shouts echoing into the frozen wilderness. That day, though, nature decided to show me exactly how small I was. The wind howled louder than ever, blowing thick flakes around, making the sun disappear entirely. I was the last one of our group to start down the slope, aiming to take a different route that cut closer to a cliffside, a narrow path, risky even in the best conditions. But the thrill called to me, and I was determined to answer. I took off, my snowboard slicing through the fresh layer of snow, carving down the mountain as my thoughts faded, replaced by pure adrenaline. But as I neared the cliffside, a sudden, violent gust of wind slammed into me from nowhere. The next thing I knew, I was out of control, helpless, skidding and then tumbling. In a blur of snow, cold, and white noise, I found myself teetering on the edge. I tried to steady myself, digging my board into the snow, but the ground was giving way under the weight, slipping down into the valley below. My heart dropped. I was stuck there, one wrong movement away from plummeting down, where sharp rocks and the slope's brutal incline would greet me if I fell. I couldn't unclip my boots. Any move I made shifted the snow just enough that it crumbled more under me. In that silence, staring down at a 50-meter drop, I felt the thrill drain out of me, replaced by something cold and primal. Minutes went by, each one feeling like an eternity. The wind felt like it was whispering to me, daring me to try, daring me to see if I could hold on just a little longer. I don't know how long I stood there, bracing myself with every muscle, the only thing keeping me up their sheer willpower. I was out of options, waiting for the mountain itself to give me mercy. Then, as if by some miracle, I heard a faint hum. A helicopter, not too far off. A glimmer of hope sparked in me, and I yelled with everything I had. My voice was drowned out by the wind, swallowed by the mountain. But just when I was about to lose hope, I saw it, a small orange speck, growing larger in the distance. I was spotted. Rescue. Relief flooded me in a way I never expected, washing over the numbness, the fear, and the silence. I held on, the helicopter's searchlight cutting through the snowy darkness, making a path of light I could follow. When they finally lifted me up, I didn't feel like the same person I'd been that morning. They told me later that one more gust would have been enough to tip the snow, sending me down with it. I'd gone out looking for adventure, but the mountain had shown me its true face that day. It wasn't there to thrill me. It was there, massive and different. And it let me know that sometimes, no matter how skilled or brave you are, it decides whether you stay or you go. We all went back to the cabin that night, no longer talking about hidden trails or untouched slopes. I sat by the fire, staring into the flames, thinking of the way everything felt just seconds before I'd gone over that edge. That place between thrill and terror, where time stops and you feel like you're in a waiting room between life and whatever's next. That night, I promised myself I'd never take that kind of risk. It was supposed to be a simple drive. I was heading down the coast, the kind of quiet evening drive where you keep one hand on the wheel and one on your coffee, cruising along winding roads while the sun dips below the horizon. I'd taken this route dozens of times, and it always felt like a little escape from the grind, just me and the ocean air. But as the sky turned darker, the fog rolled in like it had a mind of its own, thicker than I'd ever seen. It was the kind of fog that swallows headlights and makes the world disappear. I slowed down, creeping forward, when I noticed something unusual. Headlights in my rearview mirror. They seemed too close for comfort, especially given the conditions. I figured it was someone else trying to navigate through, maybe someone in a hurry. But as I kept going, the car stayed right on my tail, close enough that their headlights were nearly blinding me. I took a right at a turnoff, expecting the car would pass, but it followed. Another turn, and another, and still, those headlights stayed glued to me. That little spark of unease turned into something sharper, colder. I started calculating my options, wondering if I should pull over and let them go by. But as soon as I slowed down, they slowed down. And when I sped up, they sped up, matching my every move. With every turn, the fog seemed to thicken, closing in around me like a net. I started sweating, my hands gripping the steering wheel tighter. I told myself it was just a coincidence, maybe someone lost or a prank. But a part of me, some primal part one hadn't felt before, sensed that this wasn't someone who would just pass by. My phone was in my bag on the passenger seat, but I couldn't take my eyes off the road long enough to grab it. I thought of dialing for help, but I was trapped between the fog in front and the lights behind, pinned in a situation that felt straight out of a nightmare. I tried to stay calm, reminding myself to breathe, to keep my head straight, but the pounding of my heart seemed louder than the rumble of the engine. After a few more minutes, I saw a sign for a gas station up ahead, a tiny place I knew was open late. As I approached, I veered into the lot, hoping to lose them in the light. I pulled up to a pump, glancing over my shoulder, and sure enough, they pulled in too, parking just a few feet away from me. I couldn't see inside their car. The windows were darkly tinted, obscuring any face, any sign of who they were or what they wanted. I got out, forcing myself to act casual, grabbing the gas pump even though my tank was half full. The driver's side door of the car slowly opened, and a figure stepped out, tall, wrapped in dark clothing, face shadowed by the low lights. Every instinct in my body screamed to run, to get back in the car and just peel out of there, but I was frozen like a deer caught in the headlights. "Hey, are you lost or something?" I tried to sound casual, but my voice shook. The figure didn't answer, just stood there, silent, watching me. I could feel their eyes on me, a gaze that felt heavy, invasive, like they could see right through me. After a long, tense moment, they took a step closer, and I instinctively backed up, hitting the side of my car with a dull thud. Just then, the gas station attendant stepped out from the shop, looking between me and the stranger with a wary glance. The stranger seemed to notice and pause, then, without a word, turned back, got into the car, and drove off into the fog. I watched as their taillights faded into the mist, disappearing like a bad dream. The attendant asked if I was all right, but I could barely form words. I stammered something about someone following me, but they just shrugged, saying it was probably nothing, some weirdo out for a late-night drive. I nodded, thanked him, and got back in my car, sitting there for a moment with my hands on the wheel, trying to calm the rush of adrenaline. The drive home was quiet. The road as empty as it was when I'd started. But even now, whenever I'm out alone at night, I catch myself glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see those headlights again, half wondering who or what I would see if I did. I never thought I'd be the person scanning my partner's every move, searching for any hint that things weren't right. But when small oddities snowball into unmistakable signs, your gut feels louder than any excuse they throw your way. My story starts with a message that changed everything, or rather, the lack of one. We'd been together for almost 3 years. 3 years of shared apartments, inside jokes, favorite shows, even morning coffees with his particular sugar-to-cream ratio. It was that comfortable stage where you start letting your guard down. But about 6 months ago, I started noticing little things. His phone was no longer a shared device. It was glued to his hand, as if his life depended on it. Calls went unanswered, messages suddenly silent. His phone used to ring with silly notifications, memes, random updates, but now it was a black box, never lighting up in front of me. One evening, he mentioned needing to work late again. He'd taken on this massive project, he explained, and the extra hours were necessary. But late work hours were a recent development. He used to hate staying at the office, prided himself on his work-life balance. That night, I decided to see for myself. I wasn't proud of it, but curiosity burned hotter than shame. I drove over to his office building, expecting to find him buried in papers, exhausted but working hard. Instead, I found an empty parking lot, silent and still. I sat there for a while, half expecting him to show up, but he didn't. The next day, I asked him how the night went, just to see if he'd lie to my face. He went on about some minor crisis he'd had to stay late to resolve. I could feel my face getting hot, my stomach twisting. I forced myself to nod, keeping my voice steady, but something had cracked. Once the doubt settles in, it grows like a weed, rooting itself into every interaction. Then there was the change in how he treated me, subtle but sharp like paper cuts. He'd go through phases where he was overly attentive, almost too affectionate. Then he'd pull back completely, retreating into a quiet I couldn't understand. Our conversations felt rehearsed, almost like he was following a script he didn't care about anymore. There were these brief flashes of anger, irritability over the smallest things. Whether I'd folded the laundry a certain way or accidentally forgotten to replace the milk. I chalked it up to work stress, telling myself we'd get through it, that he just needed some space. But as I reassured myself, the evidence of his secrecy piled up like invisible bricks. A few weeks later, we were at a friend's birthday party, and he went missing for almost an hour. When he came back, he looked disheveled, flushed, and his shirt was wrinkled in a way that didn't add up. I forced myself not to think about it, clinging to the faint hope that I was imagining things. That night, when we got home, he fell asleep quickly, his breathing calm, while my mind spun. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince myself that I was reading too much into things. But even in the dark, I could feel the truth gnawing at me, each small sign adding up to something undeniable. The final blow came one rainy Friday. He'd gone out with friends, and I was at home, deciding to stay in. My phone buzzed, and I saw a message from a friend who worked at the bar he was supposedly at, asking why I wasn't there. I replied, saying he'd gone out with friends and figured I wouldn't want to join. Her response was quick, laced with the subtle pity that comes when people realize something before you do. "Oh, I thought he was here with you. He left with someone about an hour ago." I stared at my phone, the words blurring. A cold, sick feeling settled in my stomach, and I knew I couldn't ignore it anymore. I waited for him to come home, my heart pounding so loud it was all I could hear. When he finally stumbled in, the smell of unfamiliar perfume clinging to him, I didn't even need to ask. I looked at him, and he knew. There were no excuses left to give, no stories to weave. He just looked down, defeated, and all I could feel was numbness. He moved out a week later, taking his clothes, his books, and his secrets with him. The apartment felt hollow, but in that emptiness, I felt a strange kind of relief. I didn't have to wonder anymore, didn't have to second-guess every action, every word. For the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe. It started with a photograph, or maybe it started years earlier, and I only began to notice when I saw that photograph. Regardless, it didn't stop until it had eaten through my life, a slow rot that crept into every corner. My sister and I had been close once, but after she passed away last year, there wasn't much I wanted to remember. She'd lived a troubled life, one with addictions, homelessness, stretches in shelters or on the street. When she finally overdosed, the official cause of death was just a formality. She'd spent years preparing for it, even if she hadn't known it herself. There wasn't much to bury, and no one else showed up for the funeral. When I got the call from a storage unit company months later, I was genuinely surprised. They'd found my number as an emergency contact on her account. She'd been keeping a small locker of belongings all that time, things she had held on to but, for whatever reason, never told me about. Maybe she wanted to keep something from her old life private, or maybe she just hadn't thought it was worth mentioning. The storage company told me that if I didn't pick up her things, they'd be auctioned off or trashed. So, one rainy Saturday, I made my way to the outskirts of the city. The storage facility had that eerie, desolate vibe to it. Row upon row of gray metal doors under flickering fluorescent lights, the kind of place you only see in cheap horror movies. When I unlocked her unit, the first thing that hit me was the smell, dusty, stale, with a faint chemical tang, like mothballs. Inside, there were just a few boxes, a couple of bags, and some old clothes in a pile. It was strange to think that this was all that was left of her life, just a handful of things hidden away in a cold, concrete room. I almost didn't open the boxes. I thought about taking them straight to the dump, but guilt got the better of me. I felt like I owed it to her to at least look. I started with the smallest one. Inside, there were some old letters, a few drawings from when she was a kid, and a couple of photographs, yellowed at the edges, stuffed in between papers. One photo caught my attention right away. It was of her, but she looked different. I'd almost say she looked scared, but not quite. It was a strange expression, a mix of fear and confusion, and her eyes seemed unfocused, as though she were looking past the camera rather than at it. She looked younger, maybe in her early 20s, wearing a t-shirt I remembered seeing her in years ago. What made me shiver, though, was that she was standing in what looked like a small, dingy room with bare walls and one small window. Behind her, there was a shadow, a figure, barely visible in the dark, standing just far enough behind her that only part of its outline was clear. I couldn't tell if the figure was a man or a woman, or even if it was real or just a trick of the light. But as I stared at it, I felt something cold run down my spine. There was something wrong with that figure. It looked too still, almost posed. I knew she'd struggled with people in her life, sketchy boyfriends, shady friends, but this was different. Whoever, or whatever, was behind her didn't look like someone she'd ever spoken of. It looked like someone she was trying to ignore, hoping they would just disappear. The next few boxes were more of the same. Old journals, some cheap jewelry, the kinds of things you'd expect. But the last box was different. It was heavier, taped shut multiple times, and when I finally pried it open, I saw why. Inside were more photos, dozens of them, some crumpled or torn. And each one had her in it, in different rooms, different places, but always with that same figure lurking somewhere in the background, watching her with an unnatural stillness. As I flipped through the photos, a sick realization started to form. The figure wasn't just in the background. It was following her, a silent, shadowy presence that seemed to be moving closer in each photo, inch by inch. At first, it was far away, barely visible in doorways or reflected in mirrors. But in the later photos, it was closer, standing right behind her, its face still hidden in shadow, but unmistakably present. I felt nauseated, remembering all the times she'd mentioned feeling like someone was following her, the times she'd call me at odd hours, her voice shaking, asking if she could stay at my place for a while. I'd always chalked it up to paranoia from her drug use, a side effect of her fractured mind. But now, looking at these photos, I wasn't so sure. I took the photos home with me. I thought I'd look through them, try to find some logical explanation. But that night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that figure looming behind her and felt an irrational fear that it would appear in my own room, standing in the corner, waiting for me to notice it. I kept telling myself it was ridiculous, that it was just an old picture, a trick of the light, a weird coincidence. Days went by, and I couldn't stop thinking about the photos. I started digging through her social media, trying to find any hint of the places she'd been, the people she'd known. But all her accounts had been inactive for years, abandoned when her life had spiraled out of control. I reached out to some of her old friends, but no one remembered her ever mentioning anything unusual. To them, she'd just been a tragic figure, a lost soul. No one knew anything about the figure. Then one night I saw it. I was lying in bed, my eyes heavy, drifting between sleep and wakefulness, when I glanced towards the door. There, just on the edge of my vision, was a shape darker than the surrounding shadows, a figure standing in the corner, watching me. I blinked, trying to shake off the fog of sleep, but it didn't move. It just stood there, unmoving, silent. My heart was racing, but I couldn't bring myself to turn on the light. Instead, I lay there, frozen, waiting for it to disappear, willing it to be a figment of my imagination. In the morning, it was gone, but the memory lingered, as real as anything I'd ever seen. I started noticing it everywhere, in reflections, in shadows cast by streetlights, in the corner of my eye as I walked down empty hallways. It never moved, never spoke, but it was always there, always watching. I tried to tell myself it wasn't real, that I was just seeing things because of the photos, because of the grief and the guilt. But the figure didn't leave. It was in every darkened room, every silent corner. I tried to ignore it, to pretend it wasn't there, but that only made it worse. It felt like it was getting closer, like it was closing the distance between us just as it had with my sister, inch by inch, photograph by photograph. Last night, I woke up with a start, my room drenched in darkness, and for the first time, I could see its face. It was empty, hollow, a blank mask with no eyes, no mouth. Just an endless void where a face should be, staring at me, waiting. I realized, with a kind of bone-deep terror, that it wasn't going to leave. It had followed her until she broke, until she couldn't take it anymore. And now it was following me. I know how this ends. I know what it wants. I think it's been waiting for me to break, to reach the same point she had. I don't know how much longer I can resist, but I can feel it closer now, breathing down my neck, patient, unrelenting. I didn't think anything of it at first. I mean, how often do you read news about someone's entire life turning upside down because of a call from an unknown number? Exactly. But this wasn't a scam or a robocall, and I didn't know that it would be the start of something that would gnaw at me, steadily and patiently, like rot inside a wall. It was late afternoon when my phone buzzed. I saw an unfamiliar number, But on some level, I was already dreading it. Something about the random string of numbers just felt wrong, and before I could decide if I'd let it ring out, my thumb betrayed me, swiping to answer. A gruff voice on the other end spoke. "We're here to notify you that your father's remains have been recovered and identified. There's a process, but you'll need to come down to the county morgue and confirm some details." This was absurd, obviously. My father died almost 2 decades ago in a hiking accident. They never found his body, which I'd made peace with. After all, he'd gone missing in dense forest land upstate. I'd buried a casket with only a handful of his belongings as a sort of symbolic goodbye. And since then, life had moved on. My mom, she'd eventually moved on too, remarried, and seemed almost relieved to close the door on those dark years. But still, I couldn't shake the man's voice. It was cold, mechanical. Something in his tone made me feel like he knew what I was thinking, that he'd heard all my rehearsed reactions in his head before he'd even called. I argued with him, more out of reflex than logic, but he was insistent, repeating an address across town, followed by the closing statement that there'd be complications if I failed to comply. Then he hung up. A part of me told myself this was some bizarre scam, a prank maybe, but something heavier pushed me to go. Maybe it was unresolved grief, maybe a latent curiosity about what had really happened to my dad that day. I pulled up outside the address they'd given, expecting to see the usual sterile glass of a city building. Instead, it was this squat brick facility with no identifying markers at all, wedged in a back street where most people wouldn't think to look. Inside, the reception area felt like a ghost town. There was no receptionist at the desk, no staff, just this eerie silence. But almost as soon as I stepped through the door, a man emerged from the shadows of a back hallway. Tall, thin. He had the look of someone who hadn't seen daylight in a while. Without introducing himself, he motioned for me to follow him down a series of narrow corridors. His silence felt unnatural, more unsettling with each step. Eventually, he stopped and opened a door, leading me into a small room with just a metal table and some manila folders. "You want to sit down for this," he said. I could tell he wasn't the type who cared if I followed his advice. As soon as I was seated, he pushed one of the folders towards me. The label on it had my father's name, but it looked old, like it had been handled countless times over the years. My heart was pounding, even though my rational brain was screaming that none of this made any sense. The man opened the file, revealing grainy black and white photos that must have been taken on an old camera. They were of a man lying face down, half buried in soil, clothes torn, bones visible beneath strips of decayed flesh. The face, or what was left of it, had a jawline that vaguely matched my dad's. But what made my stomach turn was the background of the photos. It was unmistakably indoors, and around him were the warped remnants of what looked like children's toys. The man looked at me with this clinical disinterest as he flipped through the photos, giving me time to absorb each one. Then he said, "There's more." He pulled out another folder, opening it to reveal a set of handwritten notes. They were letters, notes written in my dad's handwriting, and they were all dated months after his supposed death. As I scanned them, a chill crawled up my spine. The notes started out almost like diary entries, recounting day-to-day things, but gradually shifting in tone, the words becoming frenzied, erratic. His final entries were pleas, scribbled in barely legible handwriting. He was begging for someone to find him, claiming he was trapped, watched, forced to play games with someone or something that enjoyed seeing him suffer. I felt numb as I read, the words a distant echo of the man I'd idolized, the man who'd taught me to climb trees and cast fishing lines, who had, as far as I knew, just been unlucky in the wrong patch of forest. I sat there trying to digest the impossible, and then the man cleared his throat. "There's one more thing," he said, sounding almost bored by my horror. He opened another drawer and pulled out a small object wrapped in plastic. He placed it on the table, unwrapping it slowly. It was a ring, my father's wedding band, unmistakable with its small dent on the inner side. I knew it because it had once been mine, a hand-me-down I'd received after my dad's funeral. But how could it be here, unmarked by time, looking as though it had just been taken off his hand? I felt myself starting to tremble, the room spinning, What is this? I managed, barely finding my voice. The man shrugged, expression unreadable. Some people, once they disappear, they stay lost. And sometimes they leave little pieces behind. His eyes met mine, and there was no comfort there, no empathy, just a quiet satisfaction in watching me squirm. Consider this closure of sorts. We recommend you leave it all here. Go back to your life. Forget. I stumbled out of that building in a daze, my mind clawing for explanations. But nothing made sense. When I got home, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that I was being watched. Days passed, each one dragging me deeper into paranoia. I began noticing things out of place in my apartment. The mug I'd left on the counter was now in the sink. The closet door that never stayed open was now inexplicably ajar. Once, I found the manila folder from the morgue on my nightstand, although I'd left it at the building. Sleep became an impossible feat. Shadows would stretch unnaturally long, and I would catch glimpses of movement just outside my vision. My father's ring, the one I hadn't touched since that day, began appearing in odd places. In my jacket pocket, under my pillow, even on my finger, though I swore I'd never put it on. A week later, I got a letter in the mail, no return address. Inside was one of those photos of my father, his body curled in that fetal position, surrounded by toys, his hollow eyes staring straight into the camera. Scrawled on the back in handwriting identical to his were the words, "It's your turn." I'm not safe here, not anymore. It's only a matter of time before they come for me. Maybe they're already here. Maybe they're waiting for me to break, just like he did. It was just another Tuesday morning at the office. The fluorescent lights hummed faintly. The scent of coffee lingered in the air, and the muffled clicks of keyboards filled the silence. I was deep in my inbox, battling the usual flood of emails, when my phone buzzed with a call from an old college friend, Mark. It wasn't unusual for him to call, but his tone this time was different. Rushed, almost frantic. Hey, he started, skipping the small talk. You know how I've been getting into DIY stuff around the house, right? Building things, fixing things. I vaguely remembered him mentioning some home improvement projects. I also remembered he was the type of guy who could barely work a screwdriver, but I kept that thought to myself. Yeah, sure. What's up? I asked, still halfway focused on my computer screen. Well, last night, I almost killed myself. That got my attention. I spun around in my chair, ignoring the unread emails piling up. Wait, what? Are you okay? Yeah, I'm fine now, but he hesitated like he was still wrapping his mind around what happened. It was the garage door. One of the springs broke while I was working on it. I didn't know much about garage doors or springs, but I knew enough to understand they held an enormous amount of tension. What were you even doing? I thought I could replace it myself. Watched a couple of videos, read some instructions. How hard could it be, right? His laugh was hollow, almost embarrassed. I didn't realize how dangerous it was until it snapped. That spring missed me by inches. If I'd been just a step closer, I'd be a goner. He described the scene in detail. The violent snap of metal, the ricochet off the wall, the narrow escape. It sounded like something out of a thriller, not the peaceful suburban life Mark usually led. But it made me think about how often we take on projects, tackle seemingly minor issues without a second thought for the risks involved. Man, you were lucky, I said, still a bit stunned. You've got to be more careful with that stuff. Those springs could take your head off. Tell me about it, he replied with a sigh. I've been a nervous wreck ever since. And, it made me start thinking about all the other things I've been messing around with. Just last month, I almost mixed bleach and vinegar while cleaning. I'd read somewhere it's effective for mold. Didn't know it could literally poison me. After that call, I couldn't stop thinking about the dangers we all overlook, especially in our own homes. The same day, I went home and walked around my place, looking at every little hazard with fresh eyes. I saw the frayed cord of my old space heater, the sharp edge on my kitchen counter, and the cluttered top shelf I'd overloaded with books that could fall on someone's head. It was strange how I'd ignored these risks for so long, as if they were harmless by default just because they were familiar. That night, as I lay in bed, I remembered another close call I'd had a few years back. It was during a family vacation to Lake Tahoe. My cousin and I had rented a boat, and it was my turn to dock it. I'd been fiddling with the rope, trying to tie it to the dock. The rope had somehow gotten twisted, and in a hurry, I yanked it hard, not realizing the tension I'd put on it. The rope snapped free from my grip and flew past my face with a force that left my cheeks stinging from the sheer wind of it. I'd laughed it off at the time, but the reality was that I'd nearly been hit in the face with a thick, high-tension line moving at full speed. If it had struck my eye or my temple, I might not be here now. Thinking back, I shuddered, feeling that lingering unease that had stayed buried all this time. My train of thought was interrupted by a faint beeping sound. I squinted in the darkness, trying to place it, until I realized it was coming from the carbon monoxide detector in the hallway. It hadn't gone off before, and I wasn't sure what to make of it. I grabbed my phone, Googling carbon monoxide detector beeping, and my heart sank when I read that it could mean a leak. I felt a surge of panic, remembering a story I'd heard about a family who died from a leak they didn't detect until it was too late. Jumping out of bed, I cracked open all the windows and grabbed a flashlight to check my gas lines. Everything seemed fine, but I decided to call the fire department just in case. They arrived quickly, checking the house thoroughly. As it turned out, the detector was faulty, but one of the firefighters mentioned that they'd found faint traces of gas leaking from my stove, probably a slow drip that had gone unnoticed for months. If that detector hadn't gone off, even by mistake, you could have been in serious trouble eventually, he warned me. I felt a shiver run down my spine, realizing that I'd narrowly avoided another silent killer. I'd lived with that stove for years, cooked hundreds of meals on it, and never once thought to check for leaks. I replaced the detector the next day. The whole experience made me painfully aware of how close we all walk to the edge, often without even realizing it. We go about our daily routines, unaware of the potential hazards surrounding us, trusting blindly that nothing will go wrong. But life doesn't always play fair, and it certainly doesn't wait for us to be prepared. A few days after the gas incident, I was at the park with my dog. I let him off the leash to run around, and he darted toward a small pond. Suddenly, he yelped, stumbling backward, paw raised in pain. I rushed over, horrified to see he'd stepped on a broken bottle, a shard slicing his paw open. As I wrapped his paw in a clean cloth, I thought about all the invisible dangers lurking, even in a peaceful park. One careless step, one shard of glass, and it could have been a lot worse. I've since started paying more attention to my surroundings, treating each situation with a newfound caution. I make sure my phone is down when I cross the street, that I always double-check my surroundings in the kitchen, and that I don't dismiss the little details as unimportant. But even as careful as I am, I know I can't catch everything. In the end, life is full of things that can kill us in an instant, hiding in plain sight or tucked away where we least expect. It's unsettling to think about, but it also makes me grateful for each close call I've survived, each silent danger I've dodged, often without even realizing it. I suppose we can never be fully prepared for all the dangers in life, but we can try to stay vigilant, to respect the unpredictable nature of the world, and, hopefully, to recognize the warning signs before it's too late. Once I got in line for the coffee shop bathroom, I knew I'd reached a new low. I'm the kind of person who holds it forever, waiting till I'm home, safe and at ease. But that day, the urge hit, and I knew there was no making it back to my apartment across town. I looked around, eyeing the crowd. College students typing furiously, suited-up business folks ordering complicated drinks, and, to my dismay, a line for the bathroom that snaked around the side. I counted 3 people ahead of me, trying to estimate how long it would take. The girl in front of me had her headphones in, subtly bopping her head to a beat only she could hear. The guy at the front looked visibly uncomfortable, shifting his weight from foot to foot, probably wondering why it was taking so long too. This was not the glamorous coffee shop experience I imagined when I ordered my fancy oat milk latte. I sighed, wishing I'd planned better. Minutes ticked by. The door finally opened, and the guy in front of me practically sprinted in, looking more relieved than anyone should ever look in a public place. I tried to distract myself, scrolling through my phone until I caught the girl ahead of me glancing back. She had a friendly face, one of those effortlessly put-together looks, light makeup, messy bun that was way too perfect. When she pulled out an earbud and offered a smile, I knew she was about to say something. "You're not one of those people who takes forever in the bathroom, right?" she asked, half joking but fully expecting an answer. "Nope," I said quickly. In and out. Efficient. She laughed, nodding approvingly. Good, because the last time I was here, someone was in there for like 20 minutes, probably doing a whole skincare routine or something. I chuckled, feeling a weird sense of camaraderie over bathroom etiquette. Yeah, I don't get people who take their sweet time in public bathrooms. Get in, get out, spare everyone the wait. She nodded, then sighed. You'd be surprised. Some people treat it like their own private spa. Before I could respond, the door opened again, and she flashed me a quick thumbs up before disappearing inside. I leaned against the wall, still smiling. Talking to strangers isn't usually my thing, but she was easy to talk to, like we'd known each other in another life. When it was finally my turn, I hurried in, took care of business, and made it out in record time, half expecting her to still be there. But she was gone, lost in the crowd of coffee shop patrons. I shrugged, grabbed my drink, and headed to a corner table by the window, the light from outside filtering in just enough to give the whole place a warm glow. I opened my laptop, fully intending to get some work done. But as I sipped my latte and watched people hustle in and out, I found myself drifting. My mind wandered back to that quick exchange in line, the kind of moment that's so insignificant it's almost embarrassing to hold on to, but somehow it stayed with me. I think it was the honesty of it. We live in a world where so much feels rehearsed, filtered, overly curated. But here was a person just talking about bathroom lines, no filters, no airs, just a genuine, lighthearted gripe shared with a stranger. It made me wonder, how often do we really get moments like that? Moments where we're not trying to impress anyone or keep up a certain image, but just existing? I sipped my coffee, my laptop screen open to a blank document. The cursor blinked, waiting, and instead of starting on the work I'd come to do, I found myself typing out what had just happened, the whole scene from beginning to end. It felt good to put it down, like capturing a little piece of humanity in all its absurdity. Maybe it sounds silly, but that small exchange made my day. It reminded me that even in a world of endless notifications, timelines, and curated feeds, there's something special about the unfiltered moments. The ones we don't document or frame, but just live. And maybe those moments, however small, are worth holding on to, even if it's just a quick chat in a coffee shop bathroom line. As I closed my laptop and headed out, I felt a little lighter, like I'd been part of something meaningful in its own strange way. Life is full of big plans and goals, deadlines, and to-do lists. But every now and then, it's the little things that remind you of who you are, and that sometimes sharing a laugh with a stranger can be more grounding than all the plans in the world. It started out like any other Tuesday night. I was sprawled on my couch, binge-watching some mindless reality show about people trying to survive in the wilderness with nothing but a pocket knife and sheer willpower. There was popcorn scattered across my lap, my phone within reach, and every intention to keep this my only plan for the night. Then the text came. Hey, you around? It was from Sarah, my best friend since high school. The type of friend who knew every embarrassing story, every missed crush, and every time I'd been a little too tipsy at a party. She never texted without good reason, so I put my bowl aside, already feeling a little curious. Yep, I replied. What's up? Her response was almost instant. Come meet me outside. I need an accomplice. Now, Sarah had a way of getting me into trouble. I could write a whole book on the escapades we'd had over the years, some legal, others let's just say borderline. But I couldn't help it. Life with Sarah was never boring. So, like a moth to a flame, I grabbed my keys and headed out. She was waiting in her car, parked at the curb, her face partially hidden under a baseball cap. She looked up and grinned as I approached, that mischievous gleam in her eye already telling me I was about to get roped into something. Get in, she said, tapping the passenger seat. What's the plan? I asked, sliding into the car. She revved the engine, pulling away from the curb before answering. So, I need you to help me break into my ex's place. I stared at her, sure I hadn't heard her right. Your ex's place? Sarah, are you insane? She shrugged, like she was just asking me to help move some boxes or pick up groceries. It's not like that. He has my favorite sweatshirt, the one with the soft lining, and I want it back. Why not just ask him for it? I suggested, knowing it was futile. Because, she replied, as if that was a reasonable answer. He's ghosting me. Doesn't answer texts, won't pick up the phone. I'm done trying to be polite. I sighed, half wanted to jump out of the moving car. But I knew Sarah. Once she set her mind on something, there was no talking her down. And truthfully, part of me wanted to see how this would play out. I've always been the quiet one, the planner, the one who's got their life together, or at least looks like it. Sarah, on the other hand, was my dose of chaos. And maybe, just maybe, I needed that right now. Fine, I muttered. But if we get arrested, I'm telling them you kidnapped me. Deal, she laughed, flooring the gas and speeding down the road. We pulled up to her ex's apartment complex around 10. The lights were mostly out in the surrounding units, just a few dimly lit windows here and there. Perfect. We parked a block away, then walked the rest of the way in silence, trying to look as inconspicuous as possible, which wasn't easy considering Sarah was in a bright red hoodie. Are you sure he's not home? I whispered as we crept up to his door. Positive. He's out of town on a work thing. How do you know? She grinned, winking. Instagram, baby. He posted a story from some swanky hotel 3 hours ago. And you think you're the stalker-proof one? I muttered. She ignored me, producing a hairpin and kneeling down to pick the lock. I didn't ask where she learned this particular skill. There are some things about your best friend you're probably better off not knowing. After a few minutes of fiddling and soft curses, the lock clicked and the door eased open. Sarah shot me a triumphant look and slipped inside, motioning for me to follow. The apartment was dark, the only light coming from the street lamps filtering through the window blinds. I stayed by the door, listening as she rummaged through the closet. Found it, she whispered, holding up the sweatshirt like a trophy. Great, I said, edging toward the door. Let's get out of here before we end up on the news. Just as we were about to leave, Sarah froze, her eyes widening as she looked toward the living room. No way, she whispered. Come here. I reluctantly stepped further in, peering over her shoulder. On the coffee table was a small, open box. Inside was a diamond ring, sparkling even in the dim light. He was going to propose, she murmured, her voice barely audible. Her face fell, and for the first time that night, she looked genuinely vulnerable. Sarah wasn't one to get hung up on emotions, but I could see this hit her harder than she'd expected. He must have bought it before everything went south, she continued, a mix of disbelief and sadness in her voice. I wanted to say something, anything, but the words didn't come. We stood there for a few moments, both of us staring at the ring. It was surreal, this little piece of jewelry that carried so much weight. Eventually, she shook her head, pocketed her sweatshirt, and turned back to the door. Let's go, she said quietly, all the excitement drained from her voice. As we drove back, the silence between us felt heavier than before. Sarah kept her eyes on the road, not saying a word, and I didn't push. This was the part of friendship no one tells you about, the quiet, awkward moments where you don't know what to say, where you just have to be there, letting the other person process whatever storm they're dealing with. When she finally dropped me off, she managed a small smile. Thanks for coming with me tonight. I owe you one. Anytime, I replied, and I'm in it. I watched her car pull away, the red taillights disappearing into the night. It struck me then how life is full of these strange, unexpected moments. One minute you're on your couch, eating popcorn, watching people survive in the wilderness. The next, you're standing in a dimly lit apartment, realizing your best friend's ex almost proposed. You never know what kind of night it's going to be. And maybe that's what makes it all worth it. The randomness, the unpredictability, the moments that change you in ways you can't even begin to understand. As I climbed the stairs to my apartment, I felt an odd sense of peace. Because even if things were messy, even if life felt like a series of bizarre misadventures, at least I wasn't alone. I had Sarah, with all her chaos and unfiltered honesty. And in this world, that was something, that was everything. Looking back, I don't know how I missed it. Hindsight is cruelly sharp, especially when you remember the innocent trust you once felt, like a kid touching a hot stove for the first time. It all started on a random Tuesday. That was the day I noticed something just off about him. We'd been together for 4 years, long enough to know each other's quirks like the backs of our hands. I knew every freckle on his arm, every odd little habit. But lately, something had shifted in him, like he was playing a character only he could see. It was in the way he held his phone close, shielding it like he was protecting a secret. He used to leave it lying around, screen open for anyone to see. Now it was locked down, face down on every surface like it held the nuclear codes. One night, I saw him smile down at it, a small, sly grin, and I felt an invisible knife twist in my chest. He said it was a work message, a funny email from a colleague. I forced myself to laugh along, nodding, but there was this strange hollowness in his words, like an actor who had forgotten his lines. Then came the business trips. He'd never needed to travel for work before, but suddenly he was flying out of town almost every month, disappearing for days at a time with minimal explanation. I tried to be understanding, rationalizing his absence as part of some new promotion. But then I started noticing that he'd come back exhausted, not with the usual tiredness of a long flight, but a kind of weariness I couldn't put my finger on. His clothes would smell like an unfamiliar cologne, and he'd bring back little trinkets from cities he hadn't even mentioned visiting. One weekend, he told me he had to go out of town for a conference, but the company was tight on budget, so he'd be rooming with a co-worker to cut costs. I nodded, still trying to be the cool girlfriend who trusted him completely, even though the story sounded paper-thin. But when he left that Friday, I decided to call his office, just to make sure. The receptionist answered cheerfully, confirming that the company hadn't sponsored any trips or conferences that weekend. I felt the ground shift beneath me, and yet a twisted part of me wanted to hear his lie face-to-face, to see how well he could weave it. I spent that weekend in a haze, every hour feeling like a slow, painful reveal of the truth I didn't want to face. Sunday night, he came home with that same drained expression, dark circles under his eyes. I asked him how the conference went, keeping my voice as casual as I could manage. He started going on about some breakout session that was apparently riveting, but his eyes didn't meet mine. I felt my stomach turn, my hands shaking as I waited for him to finish. When he finally looked up, I asked, "Did you really go to a conference?" He froze, his face a mask of confusion, but I didn't give him a chance to answer. I told him I called his office. The silence that followed was suffocating. He looked at me, and for the first time, I saw the truth in his eyes. He stammered, trying to explain, to make up a story, but the words crumbled in his mouth. He sank onto the couch, staring at the floor, admitting that he'd been seeing someone else, someone he'd met a few months ago. Apparently, it just happened, like it was something he'd tripped into by accident. I didn't yell, didn't cry. I just listened, the cold numbness settling over me like armor. I remember thinking how surreal it all felt, like I was watching someone else's life fall apart from a distance. I asked him why he didn't just leave, why he didn't tell me when he first felt that he wanted something else. He couldn't answer, or maybe he just didn't want to. After he left, I spent hours alone, replaying every moment in my head, wondering how I'd missed the signs. I remembered how a few months back he'd started suggesting I go out with my friends more, enjoy myself. He'd even offered to pay for a weekend trip I'd been considering, which felt oddly generous at the time. Now I knew it was because he wanted the space to pursue his double life without interruptions. In the weeks that followed, I went through every stage of grief, sometimes all in one day. Anger, sadness, confusion. It all blurred together. But the worst part was the betrayal, this gnawing ache that settled deep in my chest, eating away at every happy memory we'd shared. I'd been so wrapped up in us, so certain of what we had, that it felt like I was mourning not just the relationship, but a piece of myself I'd trusted to him. Slowly, I rebuilt. I reconnected with friends, buried myself in work, found new routines that didn't include him. But even now, there's this lingering scar, a reminder of how easy it is to be blindsided by the people we trust most. And sometimes, when I catch myself laughing or having a moment of pure happiness, I feel a sense of triumph, knowing that I didn't let his betrayal define me. I'd picked up the pieces carefully and rebuilt a life where trust feels possible again, but with the lessons seared deep into my bone. I'm an anesthesiologist 15 years into this job, and I've seen my share of horror stories. Working in trauma, I learned early that I'd need a thick skin, a stomach for blood, and a kind of emotional detachment most people can't understand. But the detachment's a facade, really. You only have to see one brutal outcome, one case that slips right through your hands, to know how much you're lying to yourself about being numb to it all. I was working one night during the tail end of a brutal 24-hour shift when the paramedics brought in a middle-aged man, early 40s, unconscious and critically unstable after what the EMT called a freak fall from his roof. They didn't have many details other than that he'd been doing some work up there, clearing gutters, they thought, and somehow lost his footing. It wasn't the first routine fall I'd seen turn into a nightmare, so I didn't expect anything unusual. But then they pulled back the sheet, and I knew immediately we were in for hell. His face was a mess of cuts and swelling, one eye completely swollen shut, his jaw sitting at an unnatural angle. The bruises were already deepening, dark purple spreading across his cheeks and around his nose, as if every bone in his face had taken a separate hit. His legs were twisted in a way that told me he'd fallen hard, maybe with his whole body weight landing in a single, terrible snap. But what really stood out was the bruising around his neck. Ugly, angry splotches almost like handprints. It looked more like strangulation than a fall, and I glanced at the EMTs, but they just shrugged. No one knew what happened, and the guy was barely clinging to life. We were his only shot. I put him under as the surgeons prepped, hoping he wouldn't need more than routine anesthesia, but nothing about this case was going by the book. His heart rate was erratic, plunging and spiking every few minutes without warning. I adjusted the dose to stabilize him, but the readings kept fluctuating. His blood pressure was a roller coaster, his breathing shallow and irregular. The surgeons worked frantically to secure the broken bones, pinning and suturing wherever they could, but every time we seemed to be making progress, something else would go wrong. 3 hours in, the lead surgeon threw up her hands, muttering something about internal bleeding they couldn't locate. They'd stabilized most of his fractures, but the internal injuries were a nightmare. A series of rapid bleeds that kept cropping up, forcing them to dart around his body as if they were plugging holes in a sinking ship. It's one thing to deal with a trauma case where you can clearly see the damage and respond, but this was different. It felt like his body was self-destructing in front of us, bit by bit, one failure after another. I knew we were close to losing him, and then something happened I've never seen before. I was watching his vitals, focused on adjusting his oxygen levels when, out of nowhere, he jolted awake. Now, this isn't supposed to happen. With the amount of anesthesia he'd been given, he should have been deep under for hours. But he just shot up from the table, his arms thrashing, his eyes wide, unfocused, staring at something none of us could see. The team froze, stunned into silence. He tried to speak, his mouth moving around words, but all that came out were these low, garbled noises, half gasps, half words. I thought I'd miscalculated his dosage, but even after I increased it, he was still there, clawing at the air, his broken body twisting in ways it shouldn't have been able to. I shouted for more muscle relaxant, desperate to keep him from causing even more damage to himself. And eventually, he stilled, his eyes drifting shut as he went limp again. We resumed surgery, all of us shaken, but there wasn't time to dwell. The lead surgeon looked pale, muttering under her breath as she worked, hands visibly shaking. The surgery stretched into dawn, and by the end of it, we'd stabilized him, though barely. After I scrubbed out, I went to the ICU to check on him. The nurse told me he'd been drifting in and out, not fully conscious, mumbling nonsense when he did open his eyes. I was exhausted, but something compelled me to wait. I stayed by his bed, watching his chest rise and fall in those shallow, fragile breaths, thinking about that moment on the table. I'd never seen that happen before. Someone coming out of anesthesia with that kind of intensity. It was as if he'd been pulled out of sleep by something stronger than the drugs. Eventually, he came around, blinking as he tried to focus. I asked him if he knew where he was, if he remembered the fall. He didn't say much, but his gaze was distant, haunted. He mumbled something about the roof, and I leaned in closer, trying to catch his words. I didn't fall, he whispered, his voice raspy. I asked him what he meant, and he just repeated it, shaking his head slightly. He looked at me, eyes full of desperation, and I felt a chill run down my spine. He seemed like he wanted to say more, but he just sank back into silence, his mouth closing tight like he'd changed his mind. Later, one of the nurses came by to give me a heads up. The cops had shown up at his house that morning. They found signs of a struggle in the garage, The side door busted open, blood smeared on the floor. There was talk of someone else being in the house the night he fell, a possible break-in. Suddenly, everything made sense. The bruises, the strange neck injuries, the feeling that his body had been broken apart from the inside. This wasn't a fall. Someone had done this to him. Someone had tried to kill him and left him there, thinking he wouldn't make it. As I drove home that morning, I couldn't shake the image of him waking up on the operating table, the look of terror in his eyes, like he was fighting for his life all over again. I wondered what he'd seen, what had played out in his mind that was so intense it could pull him out of anesthesia. I barely slept that day, his words echoing in my head. I didn't fall. In the weeks that followed, I kept tabs on his recovery. The detectives had turned the case into an investigation, questioning everyone who'd seen him the night of the accident, trying to piece together the events. They eventually arrested his brother-in-law, a man with a history of violence who had a grudge over some kind of family dispute. It turns out the man had gone to his house that night, intending to scare him, and things had escalated. When they got into a fight, he'd thrown him off the roof in a fit of rage, then ran off, leaving him for dead. I ran into the patient one last time after he was discharged, months later. He looked like a shadow of himself. The bruises faded, but the weight of it all still there in his eyes. He thanked me for saving his life, but I could tell he wasn't fully free of whatever happened to him on that roof. Trauma has a way of sticking around long after the body heals. I told him to take it one day at a time, but I knew that was easier said than done. That case stayed with me, haunted me for months. I've seen pain, suffering, near-death experiences, but that one night, watching him fight through anesthesia as if he were reliving it all, it's something I'll never forget. I've come to accept that some scars, the ones people carry inside, may never truly heal. And sometimes survival isn't just about beating death. It's about living with whatever it was that tried to pull you under in the first place. I'm a trauma surgeon, pushing 40 now, and to be honest, this job has worn me down in ways I never expected. I see things I can't unsee, wounds and horrors that make a permanent mark. I've been in this for over a decade, and I thought I was numb to it, but some cases shake you out of your routine and make you question your choices, make you think about things no one likes to think about. This is one of those cases. It was a brutal, rainy Friday night, and we were already backed up with a pileup from the highway. 4 cars, 6 patients. I just come out of the OR after patching up one of them. Barely had time to scrub out before my phone buzzed again. Incoming trauma, 7 minutes. All I got was stab wound to the chest, male, 16, unstable. There's always something worse waiting on the next call. They brought him in on the gurney, his face pale and blood splattered across his shirt. He looked barely conscious, his eyes glassy, chest rising and falling in shallow, erratic gasps. Blood soaked through his clothes, and from the way his breaths rattled, I knew he was drowning in his own blood. As I checked his vitals, his pulse was fading, weak and thready. I yelled for a thoracotomy tray and another surgeon to assist. With that kind of blood loss, we had maybe minutes. When we cut him open, I saw immediately why. The knife had punctured his lung and nicked his heart. I've been here before, and I knew this wasn't just a routine trauma. This was touch and go. Blood was pooling everywhere, spilling out faster than we could suction. My assistant tried to clamp the artery, and I started manually compressing his heart, hoping to buy him just a few seconds longer, just enough time for us to stabilize him. I could feel the blood slipping under my gloves, hot and sticky, and the sounds in the room were a mess of frantic voices and alarms. After what felt like an eternity, we managed to get him onto bypass and stabilize his heart. We worked through the night, patching up each tear, clamping and suturing until every vessel was as secure as we could make it. He was stable for the moment, but we were both covered in blood, sweat streaming down our faces, feeling like we'd just crawled out of a war zone. I'd been through my share of tough surgeries, but something about this one, it just felt off like the whole room was on edge. Afterwards, I checked his chart. The police had been called in for details since he was a minor, and one of them told me he'd been stabbed in what looked like a gang initiation. 16 years old, barely old enough to drive, already caught up in things no kid should even know about. It wasn't my first gang-related case, but it hit me harder than usual. I found myself sitting by his bed in the ICU, staring at his face, wondering if he even understood what he'd just gone through, if he'd have any idea what to do with his second chance. 2 days later, he woke up. I happened to be on rounds and saw his eyes flutter open. For a second, he looked around in a panic, grabbing at the foreline. I held his arm, told him where he was, explained the surgeries, the blood transfusions, the fact that he was lucky to be alive. He just looked at me, his eyes unfocused, breathing hard. Then he whispered, "Why didn't you just let me die?" It wasn't the first time I'd heard that question, but the way he said it was chilling, like he'd already decided that living was worse. Over the next few days, I found myself checking on him more often than I probably should have, partly out of medical concern, but also out of a nagging feeling I couldn't shake. He was listless, hardly speaking, his eyes vacant like he'd already given up. I overheard some nurses talking about the police coming by his room, asking questions, but he wasn't cooperating. He'd shut down completely, and it was like he was just waiting for something to take him back out of this world. I tried to engage him, asked him about his family, his friends, tried to give him some small hope for the future. But every question was met with silence or an empty stare. Then one evening I was paged to his room. He'd pulled his foreline out, tried to leave on his own. He'd barely been able to stand up without collapsing, but there he was halfway out of the bed, determined to get out. I stopped him, told him he needed more time to heal, but he looked at me with an intensity I'll never forget and said, "You don't understand. I can't stay here. I can't." Against my better judgment, I discharged him that night with strict instructions to come back for follow-ups, and he nodded, but I could see in his eyes he wasn't planning on coming back. A part of me knew I was letting him walk out into a situation where he might not make it. But what could I do? He was old enough to make his own choices, and whatever was pulling him back out into that world was stronger than any reassurance I could offer. A few weeks later, I was working another night shift when they wheeled in another trauma case. I caught a glimpse of the chart, and my heart sank when I saw his name. He'd been shot this time, close range, the bullet ripping through his abdomen. The team rushed him into surgery, but I could already see the signs. He was too far gone, the damage too extensive. We fought for hours, trying to repair the destruction, but every line we clamped just led to more bleeding. His organs were shredded, his vitals dropping faster than we could bring them back. At some point, I felt like I was just going through the motions, like we were fighting a losing battle he'd already accepted. By dawn, he was gone. Standing in that cold, sterile, or staring at his lifeless body, I felt a kind of anger that was deeper than anything I'd ever felt. I'd worked so hard to keep him alive the first time, only for him to end up here again, barely a month later, because he'd been trapped in a world that wouldn't let him escape. A part of me wanted to scream, wanted to punch the walls, but there was no one to blame, no one to rage against. He'd been a kid trying to survive in a place that didn't give him a choice, and we just sent him back to it. Afterwards, I sat in the staff lounge, numb, exhausted, and replaying every decision, every moment from both times I'd worked on him. That kid's face haunted me, his empty stare, his words in the ICU. "Why didn't you just let me die?" I wanted to believe that what we do matters, that we're giving people hope, giving them a chance to turn their lives around. But with cases like his, I wondered if we were just delaying the inevitable, sending people back into a fight they were never going to win. I went home that morning, knowing I'd carry the weight of his life and his death for a long time. I still do. It's a reminder that for some, survival isn't just about what happens on the operating table, but what's waiting for them on the other side. And that's something I can't fix with all the training and skill in the world. A few months ago, I decided to pick up a part-time job as a night shift security guard. I needed the extra money, and the idea of sitting in an empty office building watching security monitors sounded perfect. An easy gig, just me and a few cameras and silence. But if I'd known how that job would mess with my mind, I would have quit before I even started. The building I was assigned to was old. It had that damp, musty smell, and the floors creaked no matter how softly you walked. My post was at the security desk in the lobby, where a set of black and white monitors connected to cameras scattered throughout the building. At first, it was just boring. I'd read, surf the internet, sometimes nap a little when things were quiet. I didn't really care about checking the cameras. I was the only one there at night, and nothing ever happened. That was until about a week in when the screen started flickering. It started with camera 6. That one covered a hallway on the 3rd floor, and it would just cut in and out at random. sometimes going completely black for a few seconds. I chalked it up to an old, faulty camera. The flickering got worse, though, and then the others started doing it too. By the end of the week, at least half the cameras had some kind of glitch, a flicker here, static there. I reported it, but the maintenance guy shrugged it off, said the system was outdated, and left without even looking at the monitors. Then one night around 3 a.m., I saw something that made my blood go cold. Camera 6 had come back to life and was showing the hallway again. But this time, there was someone standing in it. A figure just barely visible at the end of the hall, a dark silhouette with no clear features, unmoving. My heart was pounding, but I told myself it was probably a trick of the light, maybe a shadow cast by the flickering camera. I stared at the screen, waiting for the image to clear, but the figure just stood there, perfectly still, for what felt like an eternity. I was debating whether I should go check it out, when it disappeared. 1 second, it was there, and then it was gone. I wanted to laugh it off, tell myself I was just tired, maybe seeing things. But something about it felt real, too real to be a simple trick of the light. The next night, I kept an eye on camera 6, glancing at it every few minutes. It seemed normal for the first half of my shift, just an empty hallway in a dead building. But around 2:30, there it was again, the same figure in the same spot, just standing there. This time, though, it was closer, maybe halfway down the hallway. It wasn't moving, but something about it seemed different, like it was looking at the camera, watching me. I decided to be brave or stupid, and went up to the 3rd floor to check it out. The hallway was silent and empty, just as it should be. No footprints, no sign that anyone had been there at all. I stood there for a minute, straining to listen for anything unusual, but there was nothing, just the hum of the fluorescent lights. I tried to convince myself it was a glitch, some interference, maybe a shadow cast by one of the exit signs. But when I got back to the security desk, the figure was gone. This went on for days. Every night, like clockwork, the figure would show up on camera 6 around the same time, always in the same spot at the end of the hallway. But each night, it was a little closer, inching its way toward the camera, toward me. I didn't want to tell anyone about it. Who'd believe me? I didn't want to seem paranoid or crazy, and the maintenance guy had already shrugged me off once. By the 2nd week, I'd stopped going up to the 3rd floor. I couldn't handle walking down that hallway alone, not knowing if that figure would be there, waiting. It was almost a relief just to sit at the desk and let it play out on the monitor. But then one night, I noticed something new. The figure had moved from the hallway. I checked all the other monitors in a panic, looking for any sign of it. And then I saw it on camera 4, which covered the stairwell. The figure was on the stairs, standing still, facing the wall. I stared at the monitor, my hands clammy, my pulse racing. The camera flickered, and in the next frame, the figure's head had turned just slightly, just enough to show that it was looking directly at the camera, at me. I felt a chill settle over me, colder than any air conditioning. It was as if it knew I was watching, and it wanted me to know it knew. Over the next few nights, the figure continued to move. It would appear on different cameras. One night in the stairwell, the next in the basement hallway, the next on the 2nd floor landing. It was moving toward me, closing the distance one camera at a time. I was barely sleeping by then, half expecting to see it lurking in the shadows outside my apartment, just waiting. The final night, I was a wreck. I hadn't slept, hadn't eaten. I just sat there, watching the monitors, waiting. Midnight came and went, then 1 a.m., 2. Nothing. I almost convinced myself that it was over, that maybe it had finally left me alone. But then, just after 3, camera 1, the camera covering the lobby, right outside the security desk, flickered. And there it was, just a few feet away, standing just beyond the reach of the lights. A dark shape with no face, no features, just a deep, consuming void. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. I just sat there, staring at the monitor, watching it. And then, slowly, it began to walk toward the camera, each step closer and closer, until it was nearly touching the lens. I felt a presence behind me, the air heavy and cold, like something was standing inches away from me, watching. I forced myself to look, to turn around, but there was nothing there, just empty air. When I looked back at the monitor, the figure was gone. I quit the next morning, didn't even bother with the 2 weeks notice. My manager called me a dozen times. demanding to know why I'd abandoned the shift, but I never answered. I didn't go back for my last paycheck, or to pick up the things I'd left behind at the desk. I figured it was better that way. Let someone else take the job. Let them deal with whatever that thing was. But here's the thing. It didn't end. A few nights after I quit, I started seeing it again. First in my apartment hallway, then in the reflection in my bathroom mirror, just for a second, just long enough for me to know it was still there, still watching. I don't know what it wants or why it chose me, but I can feel it getting closer, bit by bit, each time I see it. And I know sooner or later, I'll turn around, and it'll be standing there, inches away, waiting. When I finally landed my first real job, I was elated. I'd gone through what felt like a marathon of interviews, 6 of them, with everyone from HR to the CEO's cousin's dog walker, practically. They dangled the offer in front of me like a prize, and I could already see the paycheck that would finally put an end to my ramen for dinner habit. But the reality turned out to be far from the dream. My manager was one of those types who couldn't care less about people, just results. For him, efficiency meant running the team down to the bone, with no regard for weekends, late nights, or even paid overtime. Complaining was out of the question. After all, the company's generous, he'd say. You're lucky to be here. The reality of that hit me one night as I walked home after an especially grueling 12-hour day. The subway station was nearly empty, but a dog handler and a team of police officers were roaming around with their drug-sniffing dogs. The scene would have been laughable if it weren't so unsettling. They eyed every passenger like we were potential criminals. I'd heard enough horror stories to know not to make any sudden movements. A girl sitting across from me must have looked too nervous or something, because one of the dogs alerted on her. They immediately pulled her aside, making her empty her bag right there on the cold station floor. She looked mortified, clutching her phone like a lifeline. When they finally found nothing, she was given a brisk "have a good night" and dismissed. Like she'd be able to just brush it off. Those random spot checks weren't random at all, but part of the overblown security measures for public safety. It was all so arbitrary, and it left a bad taste in everyone's mouth. Even if you had nothing to hide, being cornered like that could make anyone feel guilty. Later that week, I met up with some friends at a bar to decompress. One of them, Jamie, worked in finance, and he was absolutely losing it over a new scandal involving politicians using insider knowledge to trade stocks. It was all over the news, but like everything else, it seemed destined to fade from the headlines without any real consequences. Jamie ranted about how politicians had this massive advantage, playing the stock market with insights that would send anyone else to jail. They're literally doing what Martha Stewart went to prison for, he spat. It was obvious how frustrated he was, how frustrated we all were. But what could we do? They made the rules. The night went on, and as the bar filled up, we heard a familiar, jarring sound. A commercial blaring from one of the TVs in the corner. It was one of those gambling ads, showing some guy celebrating like he just won the lottery. The rest of us rolled our eyes. They were everywhere, with catchy jingles and promises of easy wins. My buddy Mike piped up, "It's like they're begging people to blow their rent money." His dad had lost a fortune to gambling years ago, and Mike had a personal vendetta against the ads that made it seem so glamorous. They banned cigarette ads for being dangerous, but gambling? Nope. Full throttle. And he wasn't wrong. Gambling had become a shiny new plague designed to pull in anyone desperate for a lucky break. The more we talked, the more the thread of frustration tied all these things together. It was like the system had been warped to cater only to those who'd already won. Big corporations got away with selling our data, politicians exploited their positions for profit, and the rest of us were expected to slog along and hope for the best. It made me think about the data collection apps we all had on our phones. They were a part of daily life, as ordinary as checking the weather, but the truth was, those little apps were taking everything they could. Even after you read the fine print, there was no opting out without giving up the convenience they offered. They tracked our locations, our shopping habits, even our search histories. Privacy was a fairy tale. Just last month, I downloaded a seemingly harmless fitness app to track my running. But within a few days, I was getting weirdly targeted ads about joint pain, weight loss programs, and every other fitness gimmick you could think of. The creepy part? I hadn't even used the app all that much. Yet there it was, harvesting every step, every time I paused mid-run, every GPS coordinate. When I deleted it, I felt a bizarre pang of guilt, as if the app had become some kind of virtual roommate. But honestly, who was I kidding? They'd already taken whatever data they needed from me. The final straw came when my friend Sarah told us about her run-in with a ticket scalping fiasco. She'd been saving up for months to see her favorite band live, but by the time she'd logged in to buy tickets, they were sold out. A few hours later, those same tickets were on resale sites, going for double the price. She was furious, pacing back and forth, recounting how it felt like an intentional scheme. Why don't they do something about it, she fumed. They've already banned this for sports games, but as usual, the corporations had found a loophole, and there was no one holding them accountable. As we talked, I kept thinking back to my job, the endless interviews, the promise of being valued, and now the reality of being just another cog in the machine. My boss treated us like expendable parts, and every complaint about workload or boundaries was brushed aside with a smirk. He knew we had nowhere else to go. The job market was a war zone, and he was fully aware of it. The irony? He'd probably go home, kick back, and scroll through his own stock trading app, making deals we could only dream about. By the time the night ended, we were all equally exhausted and riled up. The frustrations had bubbled over, but there was no release, just a shared sense of helplessness. Maybe it was dramatic, but it felt like the rules had been written against us from the start. I was just about to drift off when my phone buzzed on the nightstand. Groggy, I glanced over at the screen. It was a text from my sister, Mia, which was weird because she never texted this late. I debated ignoring it, but curiosity got the better of me. "Can you pick me up?" I frowned. Mia was as much of a homebody as I was. The idea of her needing a ride at midnight was bizarre. I tapped back, squinting at the brightness of the screen. "Where are you?" A few seconds later, 3 dots popped up, disappearing and reappearing, like she was figuring out how to explain. "At Mom's house. It's a long story. Please just come." I sighed, throwing off the blankets. Whatever had brought her to Mom's house was obviously serious. Our relationship with Mom was strained, to put it mildly. She'd left when Mia and I were just kids. Over the years, she'd popped in and out like a guest in our lives, with long absences in between. We'd stopped trying to figure her out years ago, and Mia had barely spoken to her since high school. Now, out of nowhere, she was at her place. The drive to Mom's house was silent and tense. Every streetlight that flashed through my windshield felt like an interrogation. I kept wondering, what was Mia doing there? What had happened? I felt a pit of dread forming in my stomach, the kind that warned me that whatever I was about to learn, I wouldn't be able to unknow. I pulled up to the house, a small, rundown bungalow with chipping paint and a yard overgrown with weeds. I parked by the curb, squinting to see if Mia was waiting outside. But the porch was dark, empty. I pulled out my phone to text her when the front door creaked open, and she stepped out, looking like she hadn't slept in days. I rolled down the window. "You okay?" She gave me a small nod, but her eyes were distant, hollow. Without another word, she climbed into the passenger seat, hugging her knees to her chest like she was trying to shrink herself. "What happened?" I asked, the words coming out more urgent than I'd meant. She stared out the window, and for a long time, I thought she wasn't going to answer. But then she spoke, her voice so quiet I had to strain to hear her. "Mom's sick," she said, and the words hung in the air, heavy as a storm cloud. A part of me felt relieved, if sick meant the usual, like a cold or the flu. But from the look on Mia's face, I knew it was something else. "What do you mean, sick?" I asked, bracing myself. "Cancer. Stage 4. Her voice cracked, and she wiped her eyes, quickly looking away as if to hide her face. I stared at her, the words not sinking in. "Cancer. Mom. Stage 4. It was like she was talking about someone else, someone from a TV drama, not the woman who'd barely been in our lives since we were kids. "Mia, how did you even find out?" I finally managed to ask. "She called me a few days ago. Out of the blue," she said, her voice still trembling. "Asked me to come over. Said it was important. So I did. I figured she just wanted, I don't know, money or something. But when I got here, she was so different. Pale, frail. Nothing like I remembered her." I nodded, trying to picture her but struggling to connect the dots. And How did it go? She took a deep breath, letting it out in a shaky sigh. She told me everything, how she's been in and out of treatments, but it's too far along. They're saying it's a matter of months, maybe less. I gripped the steering wheel, feeling a mix of emotions I couldn't even name. Anger, sadness, frustration. We hadn't seen or heard from her in years, and now she was back, asking us to be part of this story she'd written without us. Part of me wanted to be angry. Actually, most of me wanted to be angry. But as I sat there, listening to Mia's trembling voice, the anger felt hollow, useless. She kept apologizing. Mia continued, her voice barely above a whisper. Said she knew she'd been a terrible mother, that she'd messed up, but that she didn't want to go without us knowing. I let out a bitter laugh. What, like this is supposed to make things right? Mia didn't answer. We sat in silence, the weight of everything unspoken pressing down on us. Finally, she looked over at me, her expression unreadable. I think she's telling the truth. I think she really wants us to forgive her. My instinct was to scoff, to tell her that people like Mom don't change. But the look on Mia's face stopped me. She wasn't looking for my cynicism. She was looking for hope, for some kind of reassurance that the woman we'd known wasn't the whole story, that there was something more to her than the hurt she'd left behind. What are you going to do? I asked quietly. Mia shrugged, wiping her eyes. I don't know. I don't know if I can forgive her. Not really. But part of me feels like I have to try. Like if I don't, I'll regret it. I can't explain it. It's just a feeling. I nodded, understanding more than I wanted to admit. The part of me that resented Mom, that wanted to let her fade into the past, was warring with another part, a part that felt a strange, painful pull toward her. She was still our mother. Broken, flawed, barely present. But she was still ours. After a long silence, I put the car in gear and drove off. Not back to my place, but toward the nearest coffee shop. We sat in the parking lot, neither of us saying anything as we stared at the building, the glow of its fluorescent lights filtering through the windshield. I didn't know what to tell Mia, and I doubted she knew what to say to me. We were both caught in this strange space between anger and forgiveness, holding on to each other for dear life. As we sat there, Mia reached over and grabbed my hand, squeezing it tightly. I looked over at her, saw the tears streaming down her face, and felt my own eyes stinging. We'll figure it out, I whispered, and though I wasn't sure if I believed it, saying it out loud made it feel almost true. And for that moment, in the quiet of the car, surrounded by the hum of the world moving on around us, we held on to that fragile promise, knowing it was all we had left. It's hard for me to know where to start. I've lived with schizophrenia since I was 17, and while people have this idea that it's all voices and delusions, for me, it's a strange mix of unreality and sometimes outright terror. I take my meds, they help, but the truth is, they don't get rid of the feeling that something is wrong, like something's waiting just around the corner. Reality's always a little bit off kilter, a shadow in the wrong place, a sound you can't trace back. Last month, I had to fly back to my hometown for my sister's wedding. My relationship with my family is complicated. They've never really understood me, never been able to separate the illness from the person. I'm just the difficult one, the one who makes everything harder. So it was more obligation than anything else, being there, and I spent most of the time trying to be invisible, hiding in the corners of the reception, slipping away from conversations. The wedding was at this old lodge, about 2 hours outside of town, near a lake we used to swim in when we were kids. The place was beautiful, but run down, smelling faintly of mildew and old wood, the kind of place that has seen better days. It had this sprawling backyard, surrounded by woods so dense you couldn't see past the first line of trees. But the inside? It felt like being inside a forgotten museum. All the furniture was antique, heavy wood with upholstery that must have been new 100 years ago. Oil paintings lined the walls, the kind that make you feel like someone's eyes are following you. The air felt thick, weighed down by the decades of people who had passed through. After the ceremony, I managed to slip away unnoticed and wandered around the lodge. Most of the rooms were empty, untouched, like they were frozen in time. There was this one room down the hall from mine, a small library, and I found myself drawn to it. The walls were lined with books, the kind with cracked leather spines and gold lettering. It was beautiful, sure, but it had that musty, closed-up smell that made it feel like the room hadn't been touched in years. There was a single armchair by the window, facing out toward the woods, as if someone had just been sitting there, watching. I started browsing the shelves, running my fingers over the spines. The titles were odd. Books about folklore, arcane symbols, things that didn't fit with the rest of the lodge. And then, on the bottom shelf, there was a stack of notebooks, tucked away like they'd been hidden there. They were leather-bound, worn and dusty. I opened the first one, and that's when things started to go wrong. The handwriting was small and cramped, scrawled in a way that was barely legible, but I could make out some of the words. It was a journal, and as I read, a sick feeling grew in my stomach. The writer talked about the shadows and the watchers, about seeing figures at the edge of the woods. He described them as dark shapes, just barely visible, with eyes that glinted in the moonlight. He talked about how they would appear in his dreams, standing at the foot of his bed, whispering things he couldn't quite make out. I laughed at myself, chalking it up to someone's attempts at writing horror, but it left me feeling on edge. That's the thing with my brain. Sometimes I can't shake what I read, and it starts to take root. My therapist calls it thought insertion, like someone plants ideas in my mind, and they start growing. By the time I closed the notebook, I was on edge, heart beating too fast, the back of my neck prickling like I was being watched. I put the notebook back and went back to my room, trying to convince myself it was nothing. That night, I barely slept. I kept hearing things, a creak, a shuffle. Each time, I'd sit up, listening, waiting, but nothing happened, just silence, thick and pressing. And then, sometime in the early morning, I heard the sound of footsteps in the hallway, soft and careful, like someone trying not to be heard. They stopped right outside my door. I lay there, every muscle frozen, too terrified to even breathe. In the silence, I could feel something there. I can't explain it. It was this heavy, cold feeling, like the air was solidifying, pressing in on me. And then, just as suddenly as it had come, it was gone. I convinced myself it was just my mind, the illness playing tricks. But I didn't sleep after that. The next morning, I went back to the library, as if being near those notebooks could somehow give me an answer. And that's when I realized something was wrong. One of the notebooks, the one I'd read, wasn't on the shelf where I'd left it. It was sitting on the armchair, open to a page that hadn't been there before. My heart started to pound as I picked it up, and I felt the words burning into my mind. It was an entry written by someone else, the handwriting different, shakier. It described seeing a figure standing outside the window, just beyond the tree line, watching them through the glass. The writer talked about feeling like they were being drawn to it, like it was pulling them outside. And the last line, scrawled with a kind of frantic, desperate energy, read, "I am not alone." I threw the notebook back onto the chair, heart racing. I told myself it was a prank, that someone was messing with me. But it didn't feel like a joke. It felt personal. And that night, the footsteps returned. This time, they didn't stop outside my door. They kept going down the hall, slow and steady, like someone was walking in circles, waiting for something. I couldn't stay there another night. I packed my things and told my family I had to leave early, came up with some excuse about work. But the feeling didn't leave. Even as I drove away, I felt like something was watching me from the trees, something waiting for me to look back. And that's when I remembered something I'd read in the notebook, a description of a face, barely visible through the trees, its eyes dark and hollow, as if it were looking for something or someone. I haven't slept well since. Every time I close my eyes, I feel it, a presence lurking just beyond my vision, hovering at the edge of my thoughts. It doesn't speak. It doesn't move. It just waits, patient, watching me. I can't shake the feeling that it followed me home, that it slipped into the back seat of my car. And now it's here, watching, waiting. And every time I try to ignore it, every time I tell myself it's all in my head, I hear those footsteps again, just a little closer, just outside my door. I'm a psychiatrist in a hospital's emergency department. It's not the place people usually think of for my field. ER psychiatry sounds strange to most. But mental health crises don't make appointments, and they don't wait for convenient hours. For a lot of people who walk through those doors, I'm the last line of defense. I'm the one who has to decide if someone goes home gets admitted, or in some cases, restrained to protect themselves. It's a job where the stakes are impossibly high. Most days, I can handle the pressure, but there are cases that stick, cases I can't shake, no matter how many years pass. It was a quiet weekday evening, around 10 p.m., when I was paged to the ER for a consult. The nurse's voice on the line sounded anxious, and I could hear the commotion in the background. She told me they just brought in a young woman, early 20s, who had been found wandering in the middle of a busy intersection, disoriented, covered in cuts and bruises. She'd been in and out of consciousness, mumbling to herself, but nothing anyone could understand. The police had brought her in, thinking maybe it was drugs or alcohol, but she had no trace of either in her system. I met her in one of the side rooms, and the first thing that struck me was how small she looked, curled up on the gurney, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders. Her hair was tangled, matted with dried blood, and her face was streaked with dirt and tears. Her eyes, though, they were wide, darting around the room like she was watching something none of us could see. I introduced myself gently, asked her name, but she didn't respond. She just looked through me, mouth barely moving as she whispered something too faint to hear. The nurses tried to clean her wounds, but she flinched every time they touched her, like even the lightest contact caused her pain. Eventually, I managed to get her to speak. She was terrified, and whatever she'd been through had pushed her far beyond what most people can cope with. She told me her name was Allison and that she had been missing for over 2 weeks. She'd been taken, she said, by someone she didn't know, held in a place she couldn't describe, a dark room with nothing but a dirty mattress and chains. She didn't remember how she'd escaped, only that she'd somehow broken free and running for hours until she'd ended up on that intersection. The story she told over the next couple of hours was horrifying. She spoke in fragments, bits and pieces of memories, each one more unsettling than the last. She described long stretches of darkness, of lying on the cold floor with nothing to do but count the sounds around her. Footsteps, dripping water, a door creaking somewhere in the distance. She'd spent days, maybe longer, trapped there, she said, with no one to hear her screaming, no one to help her. The bruises, the cuts, all of it was from her attempts to break out, her desperation to get away. I thought I'd heard it all in my line of work, but hearing her story, I had to force myself to stay composed. I knew I needed to stabilize her, but she was deep in the grip of trauma, and I worried that any misstep on my part could push her deeper into whatever darkness she'd just barely escaped. I gave her a light sedative to help her rest, and we arranged for her to be admitted to the psychiatric unit for observation. I told her that she was safe now, that no one could hurt her here, and for the first time since she'd come in, she seemed to relax, just a little. But her story didn't end there. As part of the protocol, I filed a report with the police, and over the next few days, they came to the hospital to gather details. They wanted to ask her questions, but her mental state was fragile, and every attempt to interview her sent her spiraling. She'd scream, thrash, begging us to keep the doors locked, to make sure they couldn't get in. She never said who they were, and she'd start trembling any time we tried to ask. We were able to piece together a few more details, but they were patchy, inconsistent. She couldn't remember exactly where she'd been held, only that she'd seen glimpses of industrial buildings through cracks and boarded-up windows. One afternoon, I was paged back to her room. She'd woken up in a panic, tearing at her foreline, insisting she needed to leave. When I entered, her face lit up with this strange, desperate hope, like she thought I was there to let her go. She grabbed my arm, gripping it hard enough to leave marks, and whispered, "They know where I am." I tried to calm her down, tried to reassure her that no one knew she was here, that the hospital was the safest place for her. But she shook her head, her eyes wide with terror, repeating over and over, "You don't understand. They're watching." It didn't make sense, but trauma survivors can cling to irrational fears as if their lives depend on it, so I assumed it was part of her PTSD. I talked her down and stayed by her side until she finally drifted off again, exhausted. That evening, I went home feeling uneasy, wondering if I'd missed something in her story, if there was more to her fear than I understood. The next day, I was back on shift when I got an urgent call from the psych unit. Allison had disappeared. The nurses had done their rounds, checked on her around midnight, and everything seemed fine. But during the next check, she was gone. Her room empty, the bed neatly made, as if she'd just walked out. Security footage showed nothing, no sign of her anywhere. I felt this sickening weight settle in my stomach, a sense of failure, of having let someone slip through the cracks. We contacted the police, and they launched a full investigation, but they found no leads, no trace of where she'd gone. Days turned into weeks, and she became another face in the missing persons database. I'd stare at her pictures sometimes, replaying every conversation, wondering if I'd misinterpreted her warnings, if there was something real behind her fears. Months later, I was on my way to work when I saw a news alert flash across my phone. A body had been found near an abandoned warehouse district on the outskirts of town. At first, I tried to ignore it, but something compelled me to check. When I read the details, my blood ran cold. It was Allison. She'd been found curled up in a corner of a derelict building, her body bruised and emaciated. The police said she'd likely been hiding there for weeks, trying to stay out of sight, and they suspected she'd succumbed to dehydration and malnutrition. But there was something else too. Her hands had deep cuts on the palms, marks that looked fresh, defensive. She'd been fighting something or someone right up until the end. I don't know if I'll ever understand what really happened to her. If she'd just been trapped in her own mind, lost to the terrors of PTSD, or if there was something more tangible, something I'd missed. But her last words still haunt me. They're watching. I've seen patients spiral into paranoia, convinced of things that don't exist. But I can't shake the feeling that, for Allison, the danger had been all too real, and that maybe I'd been too quick to dismiss it. I tried to save her, to protect her, but in the end, I couldn't keep her safe from whatever it was that had taken over her life. Now, I carry her memory with me, a reminder that sometimes the worst nightmares aren't just in people's minds. They're out there, lurking in places we'd rather not see. It started with a smell. They say the nose is powerful at pulling memories from the past, but in my case, it pulled out a sense of dread for the present. He came home one evening carrying a faint whiff of perfume that didn't belong to me. At first, I brushed it off. Maybe he'd brushed past someone at work or on the subway. But then it happened again the next week. This time, the scent was stronger, almost as if it were a mark he'd forgotten to scrub away. It was floral, expensive, the kind that leaves a trail even long after the wearer has left the room. I wanted to ask about it, but there was something terrifying about the idea of knowing the truth. So I held it in, convincing myself it was nothing, or maybe a coincidence, or some fluke that would go away on its own. But the perfume was only the beginning. He began to be different. He'd always been affectionate and attentive, but suddenly he was distant. He'd stop in the middle of conversations, as though his mind was somewhere else entirely. When I asked what was wrong, he'd mutter something about work stress, giving me a half smile that barely touched his eyes. He had a tendency to disappear into his phone, an old habit, but now it was constant. If I tried to look over his shoulder, he'd tilt the screen away, saying it was just some boring work stuff. There was always a reason he'd need to check something urgently when he thought I wasn't paying attention. One day, after I'd spent most of the night staring at the ceiling, tormented by my own suspicions, I noticed that he had started getting dressed with an unusual level of care. He'd always been stylish, sure, but now he was wearing cologne daily, ironing his shirts, making sure each hair was perfectly in place. I asked him who he was dressing up for, trying to keep the question light, almost teasing. He laughed it off and told me he just wanted to feel good, but the laughter didn't reach his eyes. The tipping point came on a Thursday afternoon. I'd taken a day off work, telling him I was going to spend the day with a friend, just catching up and relaxing. He kissed me goodbye as usual, reminding me to have fun. But instead of meeting my friend, I found myself parked outside his office, waiting for some sign, some answer to the knot of suspicion that had taken root in my chest. And then, there she was, a woman with striking red hair, dressed in a fitted coat and heels, laughing as he opened the passenger door for her and helped her inside. I don't know how long I sat there in that parking lot, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly I thought I'd snap it in two. I watched as he drove away with her, my heart breaking in real time. Part of me wanted to follow them, to confirm what my mind already knew, but my heart couldn't bear to accept. Instead, I sat there, numb and paralyzed, replaying every interaction we'd had in the last few months. The truth was brutal and clear. I wasn't the only one he was sharing his life with. When he came home that night, he was all smiles, acting as though nothing had happened. He asked me about my day, feigning interest in the details, while every word out of his mouth felt like a betrayal. I tried to play along, but my voice betrayed me, wavering with barely contained emotion. He noticed, of course, and asked if everything was okay, his face etched with concern that, in that moment, felt like the cruelest lie of all. I decided to wait a few days, needing time to gather myself, to figure out what I wanted to do next. In that time, I found myself spiraling, caught between fury and heartbreak. I'd spent years building a life with him, believing in us, in the version of him that now felt like a stranger. One night, while he was in the shower, I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop and went through our shared photos, holidays, birthdays, lazy Sunday mornings, and I felt the sting of each memory turning bitter. Finally, I couldn't hold it in any longer. One evening, after he'd been out working late again, I confronted him. He walked through the door, and the words just spilled out unplanned, raw. "I know about her," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. He froze, his expression a mix of shock and guilt that he tried to hide, poorly. He started with excuses. She was just a friend. Nothing had really happened, but I could see the truth behind his eyes, and I knew it was over. I told him to pack a bag and leave, that I couldn't stand another night of pretending, of living a lie that he'd forced me into. He tried to apologize, to bargain, but his words were empty, bouncing off the walls like echoes of a person I'd once loved. By the time he left, I felt a strange sense of relief, even as the heartbreak clawed at me from every angle. In the days that followed, the silence in the apartment was deafening. Every corner, every piece of furniture felt heavy with memories of us, and yet I felt strangely liberated. I no longer had to question, to wonder, to torture myself with suspicions that had stolen so many sleepless nights. Little by little, I started reclaiming the space, moving things around, redecorating, filling the silence with music and laughter with friends who rallied around me. And as the weeks turned into months, I found myself healing, realizing that I'd made the right choice in letting him go. Yes, he'd left scars, but those scars became reminders of my own strength, of the courage it took to face the truth and walk away. And in those quiet moments, when I think back to the woman in the parking lot, I don't feel anger anymore. Just a calm acceptance, knowing that some people will never understand the beauty of honesty and commitment. But I do, and that's enough. My friend Dylan had been talking up a new music festival for months, lining up all our friends to get tickets as soon as they went on sale. We set alarms, triple-checked our Wi-Fi connections, and were ready to pounce. But of course, the tickets sold out instantly, like they'd been snatched up in one giant vacuum. We were still refreshing when Dylan found out why. Corporations were buying up blocks of tickets only to resell them for outrageous prices. What should have been a $150 festival pass was suddenly going for $500. "It's like they've turned concerts into a privilege for the rich," he said, furious. The festival was once a place where anyone could go, even if it meant scraping together savings, but now it was one more thing out of reach. That ticket fiasco made me think about how many areas of life were slipping away like this. My friend Leo, who'd finally gotten his first job at a big corporate office, had gone through 5 rounds of interviews. They promised a collaborative environment, good work-life balance, the full package. But just a few months in, it was clear they'd sold him a dream. His boss was constantly pressuring him to stay late, handle extra projects just for team synergy, and to him, everything was urgent. "There's no such thing as a weekend anymore," Leo told me, exhausted. He was glued to his phone even at night, fielding emails and waiting for approval on projects he'd slaved over. And every time he tried to bring it up, his boss would just give him a look and say, "You know, some people would kill for a job like this." Then there was my cousin who'd just bought her first car. She was thrilled until she tried driving at night. She'd only been on the road for 10 minutes when she almost veered off. Some SUV came barreling toward her with LED headlights, so bright they practically turned night into day. She joked that they were anti-theft lights, designed to blind anyone daring enough to look directly at them. We'd all laughed, but the next day, she admitted she was actually worried. "They make it impossible to drive safely," she told me, frustration creeping into her voice. Every time a car with those blinding lights approached, she had to grit her teeth and squint, barely able to see the road. One evening, as we were all catching up, the conversation turned to politicians of all things. A headline about insider trading flashed on Leo's phone, and it set him off. "Can you believe these people?" he said. "Politicians, people who literally control policies, are making millions trading stocks with insider information. They know which industries will boom, which will fall, all before anyone else." He told us about a scandal he'd read about politicians voting on policies that would benefit their portfolios. "If any of us did this, we'd be in jail," he continued. "But these guys just keep getting away with it." We all nodded, sharing the frustration of knowing the game was rigged, but feeling powerless to change it. Sarah, who worked in tech, jumped in next, telling us about how her company handled data. "I swear, every app one build needs access to things it doesn't even use," she said, rolling her eyes. "They're selling user data like it's candy." She pulled out her phone and opened one of her social media apps. "Take this. Look at all the permissions it asks for. It's tracking everywhere I go, every search I make, and they're selling that to marketers." The scary part was that we all shrugged. We knew this was happening. We just didn't know how to stop it. "Privacy doesn't exist anymore," she said quietly, and the realization settled over us like a shadow. As the night wore on, Jamie brought up the gambling ads. They were everywhere now, as if we all needed a new way to burn our money. "I can't even watch a game without 100 gambling ads," he muttered. His dad had struggled with gambling for years, so it hit close to home. They banned cigarette ads for being dangerous, but apparently, gambling's fine? They're practically begging people to throw their savings away. He shook his head. It was the same story as ever. The things that hurt people were allowed to thrive as long as someone was making a profit. We sat in silence for a bit, each of us turning these thoughts over. It was like the things we cared about were slowly being corrupted, twisted into versions that catered only to the wealthy or the powerful. The jobs that used to be about passion and purpose were now about who could work themselves into the ground. The concerts that were once places of freedom and connection were turning into VIP exclusive events. And data privacy? That was just a bedtime story we told ourselves to feel better. Then Leo broke the silence, half joking but with a hint of seriousness. "What if we just moved somewhere remote, went off the grid?" We laughed, but there was something appealing about it. The idea of disconnecting from this machine that only seemed to chew people up and spit them out. The more we thought about it, the more appealing it sounded. I was at the grocery store when I saw it for the first time. Just a notification, a quick, familiar ping on his phone. He'd left it on the seat while I ran inside, saying he'd stay in the car to finish up some work emails. I had popped back out to grab a forgotten coupon from my wallet, and as I reached over to get it, the screen lit up with a name I didn't recognize. Mandy's Sparkling Heart. The heart emoji felt like a punch to the gut, an unmistakable symbol that my partner of 5 years had something or someone I didn't know about. I took a deep breath and chalked it up to an overactive imagination. It could be anyone, I told myself. Just a friend, a cousin maybe, but that tiny flicker of doubt sparked something I couldn't extinguish. That night, I replayed the scene over and over in my mind, lying awake beside him, while he slept soundly, blissfully unaware of the suspicions brewing in my head. Over the next week, I noticed other little things that might have flown under the radar had I not been primed to see them. He'd always been the type to forget where he left his phone, but now it was never out of his sight, glued to his side like a lifeline. If he got up to go to the bathroom, he took it with him. When I reached for it once to answer a call from his mom, he snatched it from my hand, laughing it off but with a strange edge to his voice. "It's private," he'd said, as if that made it any less suspicious. Our life together began to feel like a game of cat and mouse. Every morning, he'd get up earlier than usual, needing space to focus, he'd say, even though he was always a late riser. Our routines, once woven together, were now fraying at the edges, unraveling little by little. He stopped asking about my day, stopped joining me for our nightly walks around the block. It was as if he'd erected a wall between us, an invisible but impenetrable barrier, and every attempt I made to reach him seemed to push him further away. One Saturday morning, while he was in the shower, I felt a wave of desperation hit me. I grabbed his phone, hands trembling, and opened it, heart pounding so hard I could barely focus. His messages were locked, of course, but his Instagram wasn't. I scrolled through, looking for any sign of this mysterious Mandy. And there she was, tucked away in his close friends' stories, with photos of sunsets captioned with "thinking of you," tagged back to our city even though she didn't live here. Confronting him seemed terrifying, so instead, I pretended. I tried to pretend that everything was fine, that maybe this was all some horrible misunderstanding. I tried to laugh at his jokes, tried to kiss him goodnight, even as the distance grew like a dark chasm between us. But I felt my own warmth receding, my own affection chilling into something frozen and unrecognizable. Each time I saw him staring at his phone with that stupid smile, it chipped away at whatever love I had left, leaving nothing but fragments. One night, after I'd spent an hour in a futile attempt to sleep, I heard his phone buzz on the nightstand. I sat up, heart hammering, and watched him get out of bed and head to the kitchen with his phone in hand. I followed quietly, stopping just outside the doorway. I could hear his hushed voice, that low, intimate tone he used to reserve for me. He was whispering, laughing softly, saying things like, "I can't wait to see you, and I missed you too." My legs felt weak, as if the floor was suddenly unsteady. I turned around, went back to bed, and lay there staring at the ceiling until he returned, acting like everything was normal. I finally confronted him 2 days later. I don't know what gave me the strength. Maybe it was sheer exhaustion from carrying the weight of my suspicions. I waited until he came home from work, catching him just as he hung up his coat. I didn't accuse him, didn't scream or shout. I just looked at him, my voice hollow, and asked, "Who is Mandy?" He looked at me, his face going pale, and for a split second, I saw a flash of panic in his eyes. He tried to cover it up, tried to laugh it off, saying she was just a friend, but the lie was weak, threadbare, unraveling at the edges. I stood there, staring at him, waiting for him to come clean, but he clung to his story, twisting the knife deeper with every word. I told him I'd heard him on the phone, and that's when he finally broke, confessing that he'd met her at a conference and that things just got out of hand. It was over right then and there. I packed a bag that night and went to stay with a friend. Leaving felt like tearing a part of myself away, a slow, painful amputation, but I knew there was no going back. In the days that followed, I cried, I raged, I grieved the life we built, all the plans and dreams that were now meaningless scraps in the aftermath of his betrayal. Months have passed since that night, and sometimes I still catch myself feeling the old ache, the phantom pain of a love lost. But little by little, I've rebuilt myself layer by layer. I've learned to trust my own instincts again, to believe in my own worth, even if he couldn't see it. And though I still feel the scars he left behind, I know now that I am stronger than the hurt he caused, stronger than the lies, and far more resilient than the love that had once blinded me. It was just a normal Sunday, a lazy afternoon where the biggest goal was figuring out what to cook for dinner. My roommate, Jake, and I were hanging out at home, half watching some horror movie, laughing at the overdone effects and cheesy lines. It was just the two of us in the house. Our third roommate was out of town. I remember it was just starting to rain, that soft drizzle that makes you want to curl up inside. But then, right in the middle of a jump scare, the power went out. At first, we groaned, assuming it was just a minor outage. We got up, grabbed our phones to use as flashlights, and wandered around the house, checking if any lights were on. Everything was out, and without the usual hum of the fridge and the gentle buzz of electronics, the silence settled thickly around us, making the air feel strangely heavy. After a few minutes of waiting, we realized it wasn't coming back on any time soon. "Let's check the circuit breaker," Jake said, his voice echoing down the empty hallway. We headed down to the basement, trying to laugh off the spooky vibes that naturally come when you're walking through a dark house with nothing but phone lights. Jake opened the panel and squinted at it, flipping switches and muttering to himself, but nothing happened. It was just dead. Just as we were about to head back upstairs, we heard something. A faint thumping noise, so quiet we almost missed it. We froze, looking at each other, our expressions caught somewhere between confusion and mild fear. "Is that the pipes?" I asked, trying to sound nonchalant. But the noise wasn't coming from the pipes. It was coming from above us, from the attic. Thump, thump, thump. We'd been living in that house for almost a year, and I could count on one hand the number of times any of us had actually been up in the attic. It was mostly empty except for some old holiday decorations, boxes of junk left behind by the previous tenants. The thought of anyone being up there, of anything being up there, made my skin crawl. Jake looked at me wide-eyed. "What do you think? Should we check it out? Do we really have to?" I half-joked, hoping he'd say no, that we could just ignore it and go back upstairs. Let it be someone else's problem. But we both knew we wouldn't be able to shake it. It was like the house was holding its breath, waiting for us to acknowledge whatever was making that sound. We slowly made our way to the attic stairs, each step creaking under our weight. The rain outside picked up, pattering against the windows, muffling any sound from the rest of the neighborhood. When we reached the attic door, we stood there for a moment, both of us hesitating, sharing a look that said neither of us wanted to open it. But Jake, brave as ever, reached out and turned the handle, pulling the door open with a groan that seemed to echo forever. The attic was pitch black, the kind of dark that absorbs light instead of reflecting it. We held our phones up, casting the narrow beams around, illuminating stacks of boxes, shadows stretching out in eerie shapes. The thumping had stopped, but as we shone our lights around, we caught sight of something. An open window, just a few inches ajar, rain splattering against the windowsill, leaving dark, damp spots on the old wood floor. The wind must have blown it open, we thought. Relieved, we let out shaky laughs, our fear melting away. We crossed the attic, each of us reaching out to close it, grateful for a simple explanation. But just as Jake pushed the window shut, his light flickered across something out of place. There against the wall, half hidden in the shadows, was a shape. It looked like someone huddled in a crouch, just still enough that at first we thought it was a pile of clothes. But then the shape shifted, a slow, deliberate movement that felt anything but human. My heart stopped as the figure straightened, unfolding into a tall silhouette, taller than any of us. We didn't say a word, didn't even breathe, just stood there, transfixed. The figure's head tilted, as if it were sizing us up, watching us with an intent that felt almost curious, inhumanly calm. Its face was obscured, shrouded in shadow, but I could see glints of something in its eyes, something that wasn't quite right. Time seemed to stretch, like we were caught in some nightmare where we couldn't move. Then, without warning, the figure stepped back, slipping into the darkness, its shape blending seamlessly into the shadows as if it had never been there. The sound of its steps faded into silence. The attic felt empty again, but the air was thick, humming with the feeling of something unfinished. Jake and I didn't wait to find out what it was or where it went. We bolted down the stairs, sprinting out of the house, not stopping until we were halfway down the block, standing in the rain, panting, soaked to the bone but too afraid to turn back. That night, we ended up crashing at a friend's place, avoiding each other's eyes, trying to pretend we hadn't seen what we'd seen. We never did go back into the attic. When we moved out a few months later, we left it alone, convinced that some things are better left in the dark, where they belong. I get it. No hidden messages, no creepy notes left behind. Just what happened to me, and you can decide if it's real or not. I work night security at a storage facility on the outskirts of town. Most people think it's a cushy gig, and yeah, it's usually quiet. More than quiet, it's dead. No one comes out there at 3 a.m., and even if they did, there's nothing to see but rows and rows of metal storage units, all locked up tight. It's not exactly the place anyone wants to be, and especially not at night. That suits me just fine. My only company is an old space heater, a flickering fluorescent light, and a small TV that only picks up 2 channels. When the silence settles in, that's when my mind likes to wander. See, I have generalized anxiety disorder. If you don't have it, it's hard to explain, but it's like having a mind that never stops. The worry just builds and builds, and all it takes is one stray thought, a single crack, and everything spills out, pooling into some dark corner of my mind that I can't just shut off. Working here alone, I get too much time to think. And when it's past midnight and the shadows are thick and heavy, those thoughts become something else. I don't need the dark to feel it creeping up on me, but the dark certainly doesn't help. About a month ago, everything changed. It started as just another shift. The place was quiet as usual, the rows of units stretching out like a maze. Everyone locked up and silent. I did my rounds, counted the units, checked the locks, just like always. Around 1 a.m., I was sitting at my desk, zoning out to some late-night rerun on the TV, when I heard a loud bang. It came from one of the units, maybe 200 yards from my little shack. That sound was so out of place that it felt like my heart jumped out of my chest. I'm used to the usual noises, creaks, groans from the wind, but this was different. It was deliberate, like someone had slammed something metal. I grabbed my flashlight and headed out, my pulse drumming in my ears. When I reached the unit where I thought the sound had come from, it was locked up like all the others. But the hairs on my arms were standing up, and that familiar wave of dread washed over me. It felt like someone was watching me, even though I was surrounded by nothing but the rows of metal walls and silence. I checked the lock, tugged on it, and it was secure. Nothing seemed out of place. Just as I was about to turn back, I heard the bang again, this time from a different unit further down. It was like being in some twisted game of whack-a-mole. Every time I went to investigate, the sound would move, bouncing from one unit to another. I checked the lock, find it perfectly fine, then hear the noise behind me. This went on for a while, maybe 15 or 20 minutes, until finally everything went quiet. I stood there in the dark, flashlight beam cutting through the silence, and I just knew someone was messing with me. They had to be. That night, I didn't sleep. I kept telling myself it was some kind of prank, maybe a few kids messing around, but something about it gnawed at me. And then it happened again. Not the next night, but a few days later. It was exactly the same, starting with a bang, then moving from one unit to another, always just out of reach. This time, though, it ended differently. After the banging stopped, I walked back to my little security booth, and as I sat down, I realized I was missing something. My flashlight. I'd had it with me the whole time, but somewhere in the maze of units, I must have dropped it. I spent the next few nights telling myself that I'd find it during my rounds, that it was just lying out there in one of the alleys between the units. But I never did. And as much as I tried to ignore it, I kept feeling this tension in the air, like something was there in the dark, watching, waiting. Then came the worst night of my life. It was just after 2 a.m., and I was finishing my rounds when I heard a scraping noise coming from one of the larger units at the back of the lot. It sounded like something being dragged across the concrete floor, slow and heavy. Every nerve in my body screamed for me to turn around and go back, but I couldn't. I had to know. When I reached the unit, I could see something sticking out from underneath the door, something thin and frayed. My breath hitched. It was a piece of cloth, torn and dirt-streaked, sticking out just enough to be visible. My first thought was that maybe someone had been living in the unit, squatting without anyone knowing, and maybe I'd finally caught them. I shone my flashlight under the door, peering into the dark crack. Nothing. Just the cold, empty floor of the storage unit. But that didn't explain the cloth, didn't explain the feeling crawling up my spine. I couldn't take it anymore. I ran back to my booth and called the police, trying to explain that someone had been messing around in the units, that something was wrong. They sent an officer out, a young guy who looked more bored than anything. He walked the rows with me, listening as I tried to explain, but there was nothing for him to see. No one hiding, no signs of forced entry. Just that piece of cloth, which he said was probably from a moving blanket. That should have been the end of it. They'd come out, checked it over. I should have felt safer, should have been able to convince myself it was all in my head. But every night after that, the noises continued. The banging, the dragging, and once a soft scraping that sounded like fingernails on metal. I couldn't eat. I couldn't sleep. It was like I was the one locked in, trapped in that maze of metal walls. My anxiety was so bad, I thought I was going to snap. One night, after another round of noises, I finally decided to quit. I was done. I didn't care about the job, didn't care about the rent or bills. I just needed out. I walked the rows one last time, collecting the spare locks, keys, doing my final rounds. Just as I was about to lock up, I felt it. A presence. I can't explain it, but it was like every instinct, every bit of dread I'd felt came crashing down at once. I turned, and there was a figure standing in the shadows between the units. My flashlight hit empty air, but for a second, I could have sworn I saw eyes staring back at me, glinting in the darkness. And then it was gone. Just shadows, empty and silent. But that was it for me. I ran, locked the gate, and I never went back. I've heard stories about people seeing things out in places like that, things they can't explain. I always figured it was just talk, the kind of thing people say to make a boring job seem interesting. But I know what I felt, what I saw, or almost saw. It was like the shadows had a life of their own, like they were hiding something just out of reach, waiting for someone like me to notice. Since then, I've had this feeling, this nagging sense that it's not over. That somewhere in some corner of that lot, something is still there waiting. And every now and then, late at night, I catch myself listening, expecting to hear that bang, that scrape, even though I'm miles away. It's like the memory of that place has latched onto me, a dark spot on my mind that won't let. There's a peculiar sense of security that comes from living in a familiar place, where you know every creaky floorboard, every chipped paint corner, and every flickering light. But sometimes, even in the places we feel safest, danger can be lurking in ways we'd never imagine. For me, that realization struck one summer evening, during what seemed like an ordinary night at home. I just finished dinner and was cleaning up, music humming from the small speaker on my kitchen counter. As I reached under the sink to grab a cleaner, I saw an old bottle of bleach sitting in the back, nearly forgotten. I glanced over at a stubborn stain on the countertop and thought about a cleaning hack I'd seen online, which involved mixing bleach with vinegar. It seemed like a quick solution, so I grabbed both bottles without thinking twice. The moment I started mixing the two, an acrid, choking smell filled the air, sharp enough to make my eyes water and my throat burn. Panic surged through me as I dropped the bottles and staggered back, realizing my careless mistake. I'd unwittingly created chlorine gas, something I'd only ever read about in history books about World War I. My mind raced as I fumbled to open the windows, gasping for clean air. I was alone in the house, and the silence made the danger feel even more real, amplifying every cough, every wheeze, until I finally staggered out onto the porch. I sat there, chest heaving, until my breathing slowed. It hit me how close I'd come to a serious accident from something so ordinary, so seemingly harmless. The experience stayed with me, lingering like a bruise. I couldn't shake the thought that I'd almost hurt myself with a simple cleaning task. A few days later, I started noticing other hidden dangers around my house, things I'd previously brushed off. My grandpa had warned me once about the dangers of the little things we overlook. He'd spent his life working on construction sites, surrounded by machines, chemicals, and heavy equipment. He used to say, "It's not the big things that get you. It's the small stuff you don't see coming." At the time, I thought he was exaggerating, but now I began to understand what he meant. One of those small things that came to mind was the clutter in my garage. I had an old shelving unit stacked with cans of paint, solvents, and some rusty tools. Every time I grabbed something off the shelf, I'd feel the whole thing wobble. It was one of those things I kept meaning to fix but never got around to. A few weeks after the bleach incident, I decided to tackle it. As I carefully unloaded the shelves, I noticed that some of the solvent cans were dented, leaking faint fumes. My stomach dropped. If something had sparked nearby, like the ancient light switch just a few feet away, my entire garage could have gone up in flames. That realization sent me down a rabbit hole of cleaning and safety checks. I made sure all my fire alarms worked, installed a carbon monoxide detector, and even invested in a fire extinguisher. I realized how much I'd taken for granted, how many hazards I'd overlooked because they seemed trivial or unlikely to cause harm. Not long after, I found myself sharing these thoughts with my friend Sam over drinks. Sam had always been a bit of a daredevil, the kind of guy who thought safety rules were just suggestions. But when I mentioned the bleach and vinegar incident, he grew unusually quiet. He told me about a close call he'd had while hiking last year. Sam loved the outdoors, and he'd gone on a solo trek in a remote area, one he'd hiked 100 times before. There was a section with a fast-moving river that he'd always crossed easily, hopping from rock to rock. This time, though, the water was higher, rougher. Halfway across, he slipped, and his foot got wedged between two rocks underwater. The current pushed against him so hard he couldn't free his foot. He described the raw panic he felt, the realization that no one knew exactly where he was. If he couldn't get free, he'd be swept under. After a terrifying struggle, he managed to pull himself up, soaked and shaking. He admitted it was the first time he'd truly felt his own mortality. "I was always the it'll never happen to me guy," he said. "Now I know better." That conversation stuck with me. It was a reminder that even people who seem invincible can find themselves vulnerable in ways they'd never imagined. I started paying closer attention to those hidden dangers, even the ones outside of my home. One afternoon, I was driving down the highway, lost in thought, when a small rock flew up from the road and hit my windshield. I flinched as a thin crack snaked across the glass. It wasn't serious, but it got me thinking about the countless near misses we experience on the road, the things we barely register, but that could change our lives in an instant. Another time, I was sitting on my balcony, enjoying the sunset, when I heard a commotion across the street. I looked over and saw an older man stumbling down his front steps, clutching his chest. His wife was shouting for help, and before I knew it, paramedics arrived, loading him into the ambulance. Later, I learned he'd suffered a heart attack, one that came on without warning. He'd been perfectly healthy, walking his dog every morning, gardening every afternoon. Seeing that shook me, reminding me how fragile our bodies are, how even a moment of neglect, like ignoring chest pain or skipping a doctor's visit, could have life-altering consequences. Since then, I've made an effort to be more mindful, to recognize the importance of small decisions. I check my tires before long drives, I'm cautious about what I mix in the kitchen, and I stay aware of my surroundings when I'm out. I still live my life, but I don't take safety for granted anymore. There's a certain peace that comes from being aware, from respecting the thin line that keeps us safe. I know I can't control everything, but I can control how I approach life's hidden dangers. It's not about living in fear, but about being prepared, about acknowledging that life is unpredictable and often unforgiving. We walk through this world as though we're invincible, but the truth is, we're all just a slip, a snap, or a breath away from disaster. And maybe in recognizing that, we're better off living with eyes open, heart steady, ready for whatever comes next. I still don't know what exactly happened to me, but I'm starting to believe that no one ever really knows what they're signing up for when they go on these temp jobs. You don't ask questions when you're desperate, right? I had just come off a bad breakup, living on a friend's couch, barely scraping by. So when a staffing agency called with a well-paid overnight position, I jumped on it without a second thought. The job sounded easy enough. Catalog and pack up old files for a law firm that was moving. I'd be alone, after hours, and they offered twice the normal pay. Seemed like a no-brainer. The building was in the industrial part of town, a solid 40-minute drive from anywhere I normally went, but I didn't care. I just wanted the money. The first night went fine. The office itself was on the 12th floor of an old building. The lights were dim, the hallways narrow and lined with outdated, dark wood paneling, and everything had that dusty, stale smell that only old offices seem to have. But it was just files, right? No big deal. I was given a key card and told where the supply closet was for boxes and packing tape. All I had to do was organize, log, and pack until my shift ended at 6 a.m. The only odd thing they mentioned was that I should avoid using the elevator after midnight for maintenance reasons. Seemed like overkill, but whatever, I could take the stairs. My first 2 nights were completely uneventful. I boxed up hundreds of files, taped up the boxes, and left them by the door. By the end of night 3, though, I started noticing strange little things. One box I taped up was unsealed when I came back from a quick bathroom break, the lid just slightly ajar. I figured maybe I hadn't closed it right and didn't think much of it. But then it happened again. And again, boxes I'd clearly sealed were coming unsealed, one by one. And once, I swore I saw something skitter away out of the corner of my eye. It was so fast, like a shadow darting just beyond my field of vision. Then on night 4, things took a turn. I was working through a particularly dusty filing cabinet in a cramped room at the back of the office. I was deep in the files when I felt a breeze, like a sudden, icy draft. I glanced around, confused, because there were no windows in this room. And then I noticed the door to the hallway was shut. It was always supposed to be open, but it was now tightly closed. I got up, a little freaked out, and went to open it. It wouldn't budge. The handle felt cold and rigid, like it was locked from the other side. Panic started to creep in, but I forced myself to take a deep breath. Maybe it was some kind of auto-locking door. Maybe I just hadn't noticed it before. I tried my key card, but the door stayed shut. That's when I heard the noise. It was faint, almost imperceptible at first, like someone muttering or whispering. I couldn't make out any words, just this low, droning hum that seemed to be coming from somewhere above me. I looked up, shining my phone's flashlight on the ceiling. Nothing, but the sound was getting louder, and my gut was telling me to get out. I turned back to the door and started banging, yelling for anyone who might still be in the building. There was no answer. I tried kicking the door, tried forcing it open, but it wouldn't give. I was about to use the desk phone to call the building's emergency line when the lights went out. I stood there, frozen, breathing hard, trying to adjust my eyes to the darkness. My phone was my only light, and I kept it trained on the door, my hand shaking. The muttering sound stopped. There was a dead silence, and then I heard a new noise, a dragging, scraping sound like something heavy being pulled across the floor outside the door. My heart was pounding so hard I could barely think. I moved back toward the far wall, watching the door, praying I'd imagined it. The scraping sound stopped, and everything went silent again. Just when I thought I might be able to breathe, the doorknob started turning slowly. I could see it, even in the dark, moving so slowly, as if whatever was on the other side was testing it, trying to decide if it wanted to come in. I backed up further, and my heel hit something soft. I turned, shining my light down, and saw a small stack of paper on the floor, a pile of old, yellowed case files I hadn't touched yet. But there was something wrong with them. They were open, scattered across the floor, and each page had my name printed across it in huge, dark letters, over and over, like someone had written my name in thick black ink until it bled through the paper. I stumbled back, panicked, trying not to scream. I looked up, and that's when I saw something that nearly stopped my heart. There was a figure standing in the corner of the room, a shadowy shape that hadn't been there before, barely visible, but unmistakably watching me. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. And then, as I stood there, I heard it whisper my name. It wasn't loud. It wasn't angry. It was soft, almost pleading, but it was definitely my name, spoken in this low, raspy voice that sounded like it hadn't been used in years. I didn't know what else to do, so I threw myself against the door, clawing at it, kicking, screaming, trying to get out. The light on my phone flickered, and for a second I thought it was going to go out. I tried my key card again, swiping it frantically over and over until finally I heard a click. I threw the door open and ran, not daring to look back. I flew down the hallway, barely seeing where I was going, too scared to even try the elevator. I burst into the stairwell and ran down, taking the steps 2 at a time, half expecting to hear that scraping sound following me. But all I heard was the echo of my own footsteps and my own ragged breathing. When I finally reached the lobby, I didn't stop. I ran straight to my car, jumped in, and sped off. I didn't go back to collect my paycheck, didn't answer any calls from the agency. I just left, told them I wasn't interested, that they could keep their damn money. I'd love to say that was the end of it, that it was just some twisted prank or my mind playing tricks on me after too many nights alone in that creepy old office. But a few weeks later, I started getting calls from a block number. I'd answer, and no one would be there. Just that same faint, raspy whisper, like someone saying my name over and over, softer each time. Then, last week, I came home to find a stack of yellowed files sitting on my kitchen counter. My name was scrawled across every page, written over and over in that same thick, black ink. I don't know how they got there. I don't know who put them there or why. But every night since, I've woken up to that same whisper somewhere in my room, close enough that I can feel the breath on my ear. I've tried staying awake, leaving the lights on, even sleeping in my car, but it doesn't matter. I can still hear it. I don't know what it wants or why it picked me, but I have this horrible feeling that it's not going to stop until I go back. Or worse, that it's going to make sure I never leave. I'm not sure how to explain this in a way that makes sense. It's not mystical or supernatural. It's just the strangest and most terrifying thing I've experienced in my life, and I don't know if I'll ever fully shake it. This happened about a year ago, and even though I'm in therapy now and doing everything I can to process it, I don't think I'll ever feel the same sense of safety I used to. I guess you could say that I was taught a lesson I'll never forget. I work as a social worker, specifically with clients dealing with extreme isolation and mental health crises. Most of my job involves coordinating resources, helping them access services, and following up to make sure they're coping. My clients are often in situations where they're neglected by the system or simply don't have any family left, so I end up being one of the only people they regularly see. It's a draining job, but it feels like I'm doing something that matters, especially for people who are overlooked. One of my clients, I'll call him Mr. Harris, was in his 70s and had lived in the same apartment for decades. He had no family, no friends, and was on disability. He barely left his apartment, and honestly, every time I saw him, it looked like he hadn't moved since the last time I was there. He had this apartment full of knickknacks, old books, and dusty furniture. It smelled faintly of mildew and something else I couldn't place, but was a little sickly sweet. You could feel the years of solitude clinging to the walls. Mr. Harris wasn't dangerous, but he was difficult. He rarely spoke, and when he did, it was just to tell me he didn't need anything, even if he clearly did. He'd sometimes mutter things under his breath, his voice shaking, but he'd never make eye contact. I try to be patient with him. People like Mr. Harris live with a constant sense of being overlooked and undervalued, so I made it my mission to make sure he knew someone cared, even if it was in the smallest ways. One week, I was scheduled for a regular check-in with him. When I arrived, I knocked, but there was no answer. This wasn't unusual. Sometimes he'd take a while to come to the door, and I assumed he was probably just in the back room and hadn't heard me. I knocked again, waited a minute, and then decided to use the spare key the building had provided for welfare checks. I opened the door and called his name, still no answer. As I stepped inside, the first thing I noticed was the smell. It wasn't just the usual mustiness of his apartment. It was thick, rancid, like old food or something that had been rotting. I walked down the narrow hallway and into his small living room, expecting to see him in his usual chair, but it was empty. Then I heard a faint noise coming from his bedroom. This low, shuffling sound, almost like scratching. I called his name again, hoping he'd answer, but he didn't. The door to his bedroom was partially open, and I could see just a sliver of the room. I was getting anxious by this point, so I pushed it open the rest of the way, bracing myself for the worst. But there was nothing in the room. His bed was made, the way he always kept it, everything in its place. I took a few steps inside, scanning the room, and then I heard the noise again, coming from under the bed. I felt my heart pounding. I didn't want to look, but at the same time, I couldn't just ignore it. So I knelt down, lowered my head, and looked underneath. There, lying on his back, was Mr. Harris. His eyes were open, but he was breathing so shallowly that at first, I thought he was dead. When he saw me, he didn't react. He just stared at me with this vacant, hollow look. His hands were curled up, almost like claws, and his skin was pale, almost grayish. I tried to coax him out, telling him it was okay, that I was there to help. But he didn't move, didn't respond. It was like he'd retreated into this tiny space under his bed and couldn't find his way back out. I kept talking to him, trying to reach him, but it was like he was in some kind of trance, his gaze fixed on something I couldn't see. At this point, I was more than a little shaken, so I called emergency services. They arrived quickly, and after a lot of effort, they managed to pull him out. He didn't resist, but he didn't cooperate either. He just lay there limp, unresponsive. I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd interrupted something, like he'd gone to that dark, hidden place on purpose, as if it was his only escape. Mr. Harris was taken to the hospital, and they kept him there for evaluation. They found out he'd stopped eating and was severely dehydrated. He'd apparently been lying under that bed for days, without anyone knowing. The doctors said it was a mental health crisis, that he'd basically shut down, unable to face the world anymore, even the small world of his apartment. But here's the part that's haunted me since that day. When he finally started talking again, a few days later, he told the doctors he hadn't gone under the bed to hide. He said he'd heard something calling to him, something from deep inside the walls. He said it wasn't the first time, either, that this presence had been there for years, waiting for him to finally come to it. He said he'd ignored it for as long as he could, but eventually, he'd given in. It would be easy to write this off as a hallucination or paranoia, but something about the way he spoke, the intensity in his voice, shook me. I've worked with a lot of clients dealing with mental illness, but this was different. It was like he genuinely believed that something in that apartment wanted him, had been pulling him in little by little until he couldn't resist anymore. The building was old, and some of the other residents were elderly as well, people who'd been there for years. After that incident, I started hearing stories. People talking about strange sounds, cold spots, feelings of being watched. It was subtle, but there was a pattern, a sense that Mr. Harris wasn't the only one who'd felt like there was something in that building, something beyond just loneliness or isolation. I visited him a few more times in the hospital, but he was different. Whatever he'd experienced, whatever had driven him under that bed, it had left a mark. He looked hollowed out, a shell of the person he'd been. Eventually, he was moved to a long-term care facility. I never saw him again. I know it sounds dramatic, maybe even like I'm reading too much into it, but after that day, I couldn't go back to that building without feeling like I was being watched, like something was lurking just out of sight. I'd stand in the hallways, listening, waiting, expecting to hear something, a whisper, a creak, anything. It's been over a year since that happened, and I still think about it every day. It's not just the memory of finding him under the bed or the look in his eyes. It's the realization that sometimes people aren't just fighting their own minds. Sometimes it's the environment around them, the spaces they live in, that seems to absorb everything, pulling them deeper and deeper into a darkness you can't just explain away. I wasn't supposed to be on the night shift alone. They'd scheduled me with Derek, but he called out last minute, said his wife was in labor. So there I was, midnight to 8 a.m., in a mostly empty, poorly lit building. Technically, it was an office complex, but most of it had been converted into a research lab for this tech company that specialized in personalized AI. They said it was for healthcare, but honestly, it felt more like they were building the world's creepiest surveillance system. I was there to keep an eye on things, make sure no one broke in, but the company kept things so tight-lipped that none of us ever really knew what they were working on. It was quiet, and I was on edge. I've been on plenty of night shifts before, but this place had a certain energy to it, like the walls were watching you. Around 1 a.m., I decided to do a quick walkthrough. The company had a policy of checking every room at least once during the night, and I liked to get it over with so I could relax for the rest of the shift. I grabbed my flashlight and started with the main hall, working my way toward the labs at the back of the building. Everything was normal at first, just the usual rows of computers, empty desks, and the hum of servers coming from behind closed doors. But as I reached the far side of the building, I noticed something strange. There was a small red light flashing on a door labeled R&D Restricted Access. I hadn't seen that light before, and the door was supposed to be locked, off limits even to security. But it was open, just a crack, like someone had forgotten to close it properly. I should have just reported it and gone back to my station, but curiosity got the better of me. I figured I'd peek in, maybe make sure no one had broken in. I pushed the door open slowly and stepped inside. The room was filled with rows of servers, but these were much larger and older than the others. They took up most of the space, leaving only a narrow path between them, leading toward a glass-walled chamber at the back. Inside the chamber was what looked like an enormous bank of monitors, all flickering with lines of code. As I got closer, I started to make out words on the screens. My name was on one of them. First name, middle initial, last name. It was strange, but I figured it must have been some random coincidence, maybe a test screen or placeholder data. But then the screen changed, and I saw my birth date, my address, and even my mother's maiden name. It wasn't a coincidence. This machine knew me. That's when I heard a faint buzzing sound, like the static on an old radio. I looked around but couldn't pinpoint where it was coming from. I reached for my radio to call the security office, but all I got was static. Then, the screen with my name on it flickered again, and a line of text appeared. Do not leave this room. I felt a chill run down my spine. I tried to tell myself it was a prank, maybe some tech guy messing with a new security guy, but something about it felt too deliberate. I backed up a few steps, and the screen changed again. If you leave, you will not make it out of the building. I didn't wait to see what it would say next. I turned and bolted back toward the door, heart hammering. As I reached the doorway, my phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out, and there was a text from an unknown number. Stop now. Turn around. I ignored it, sprinting down the hallway toward the main exit. But as I got closer, I saw something that stopped me dead in my tracks. Standing in front of the exit was a man in a dark suit. His back was to me, but I could see he was tall, with a posture that was unnaturally rigid. He didn't move, didn't even flinch as I skidded to a halt. For a second, I thought maybe he was a security guard or one of the researchers, but something about him felt off. His head was tilted at a strange angle, like he was listening for something. I tried to back away quietly, but the moment I took a step, he turned around. His face was blank, emotionless, like he was staring right through me. I thought about running back to the R&D room, but then I noticed something strange about his face. His eyes weren't blinking, weren't even moving. They were just fixed on me, wide and staring. He raised one hand, slowly pointing down the hall, back toward the R&D room. I took a step backward, and he took a step forward, still pointing. Then I felt my phone buzz again. Another text. Return to the room, or we'll do it for you. I didn't know what we meant, and I didn't want to find out. I turned and ran back down the hall toward the R&D room, nearly tripping over my own feet as I stumbled inside. I slammed the door shut and backed away, breathing hard. The room felt darker, like the shadows had deepened somehow. The monitors flickered again, and the text reappeared. Thank you for your cooperation. A door on the other side of the room opened, one I hadn't even noticed before. It led into another lab, smaller, with just a single desk and chair, surrounded by walls lined with security cameras, all focused on different parts of the building. There was no sign of the man in the suit, but as I looked at the camera feeds, I saw something worse. The monitors were filled with images of myself. Every moment of that night was playing back on screen after screen. Me checking the halls, me entering the R&D room, me running back down the hall. They'd been watching me the entire time. Then I saw a new feed appear on one of the monitors. It was live footage taken from just outside the door I'd come through. The man in the suit was there, waiting. He was facing the camera now, staring directly into it as if he knew I was watching. He raised his hand again and pointed at the door. I don't know what I was thinking, but I tried to lock it, knowing somehow it wouldn't matter. The text on the monitor changed again. There is no escape. Then, one by one, the lights in the room started to go out until only the faint glow of the monitors remained. I backed into a corner, trying to stay out of the camera's view, but I knew it didn't matter. They could see me no matter where I went. The screen showed one final message. We need you to finish the project. The door handle started to turn. I braced myself, hoping I could make it out of there, but deep down, I knew I wouldn't. The last thing I remember was that door swinging open, the faint sound of static buzzing louder, and the silhouette of that man in the suit stepping toward me, his unblinking eyes fixed on mine. I woke up in a hospital bed a week later. They told me I'd been found outside the building, passed out from exhaustion, but I knew they were lying. They'd wiped everything, every trace of my shift that night. I tried to go back to work, try to find out what had happened, but the company had shut down. No trace of it existed anymore. And now, every night I get a text from an unknown number. The project is unfinished. We're waiting.